There is a house somewhere in England. It is a large house, a very large house, and the year is somewhere around 1880, though it could just as easily be 1860 or 1875. The exact year doesn't much matter for what we're about to do tonight. What matters is the house itself, the way it sits at the end of a long gravel drive, half hidden behind a row of elm trees that creak very softly in the November wind. The way it looks from the outside, all pale stone and tall sash windows, as though it has stood there forever and intends to stand there forever still. The family who owns this house is asleep. They have been asleep for several hours now, but the house is not quiet, because beneath the family's bedrooms and behind the green baize door at the end of the east corridor, and down the back staircase that the family never uses, and along the stone-flagged passage that runs beneath the kitchen, there are people still awake. Still working, still moving through the darkness of the house with soft, careful footsteps, performing tasks that the family will never see and never fully know about, and perhaps never entirely understand. Tonight you are entering that house. Not through the front door, that would not be appropriate, and besides, it is locked. You are entering through the servants' entrance, around the side of the building, where the stone path is worn smooth from decades of use. The door there is never locked. There is always someone coming through it, or going out of it, at almost any hour. Come inside then, mind the step. The stone passage is cool and smells faintly of coal dust and something sharp and clean, lye soap, perhaps, or the residue of some astringent cleaning solution whose name you wouldn't recognize. The ceiling is low here. The walls are bare. There are no paintings, no wallpaper, no carpets underfoot. Those things begin at the green baize door, on the other side of which is the family's world. This side is something else entirely. This is the working world of the Victorian house. And tonight, slowly and quietly, we are going to explore it. And before we begin, just a quiet word. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, unhurried journey through history, the kind where we don't rush, where we let the details breathe, where the past unfolds the way a good fire dies down, gradually and warmly, then it might be worth staying close to this channel. There is always another story waiting. Another quiet corner of history that no one talks about at dinner parties, but that turns out, when you sit with it for a while, to be absolutely fascinating. A gentle subscribe, if you're so inclined, would mean the world. But either way, you're here now, and the house is waiting, and that is more than enough. So, let us begin. The house before dawn. The first thing you need to understand about a Victorian household, a large one, a well-run one, is that the day began long before the family knew it had started. Long before. In houses of sufficient size and wealth, the servants' day could begin as early as 5 o'clock in the morning. In some houses, particularly those with elaborate heating requirements or large kitchen operations, it began at 4:30. There are accounts, genuine accounts, written down by women who lived this life, of beginning work in the hours that most of us would still call the middle of the night. Getting up in the dark, dressing in the dark, moving through the dark house with nothing but a small candle stub for company, beginning work on tasks that had to be finished before the family stirred, before the bells began to ring, before the elaborate machinery of the upper household clicked into motion. This is where we are then. In the gray and cold of the very early morning, the kitchen range. If you have never seen a Victorian kitchen range in operation, or rather, if you have never been responsible for one, it is perhaps difficult to understand quite what a central, demanding, temperamental object it was. The kitchen range was the heart of the house, in a literal and a practical sense. It provided heat for cooking, heat for water, heat sometimes for adjacent rooms. It was the reason the cook, and the scullery maid, and in smaller households, the general servant, the girl who did everything, had to be up before 5, because the range had to be lit, and before it could be lit, it had to be cleaned. And cleaning it was, by any honest measure, one of the most unpleasant jobs in the entire house. The process was not quick, it was not simple, and it was not, in any real sense, pleasant. First, the ashes from the previous day had to be raked out. The range would have been allowed to die down overnight, or in the case of larger kitchens, allowed to tick over at a very low heat, and the accumulated ash from a full day's burning had to be cleared away before any new fire could be laid. This ash was fine and gray and extraordinarily penetrating. It settled on everything. It worked its way into the creases of your clothing, into the skin of your hands, into your hair. The servants who raked ashes first thing in the morning had a particular look about them, a gray, dusty look, especially around the forearms and face, that was entirely their own. The ash was not simply thrown away. That would have been wasteful, and wastefulness was not, in a well-run Victorian household, tolerated. The ash had uses. It could be used in the garden as a soil conditioner. It could be mixed with other materials and used in certain cleaning preparations. It was collected in a large metal bucket, the ash bucket, which lived beside the range, and sorted, at least nominally, for these purposes. Though in practice the sheer volume of ash produced by a working kitchen range often exceeded what could reasonably be put to these secondary uses, and a good deal of it simply ended up in the ash pit at the back of the property. After the ash came the black leading. Black leading was the process of applying a mixture, made primarily from plumbago, which is a form of graphite, to the cast iron surfaces of the range, in order to keep it from rusting and to give it a dark, presentable finish. The mixture came in small cakes or blocks, which had to be mixed with water or a small amount of turpentine to produce a paste, and this paste had to be applied to the range with a brush, worked in, allowed to partially dry, and then buffed to a shine with a separate soft cloth or brush. The result, when done properly, was a range that gleamed, solid, dark, authoritative, the kind of object that announced, without saying anything, that it was being properly maintained. The process of achieving that gleam, however, was not glamorous. The black lead mixture was dark and it stained. It stained the brushes, the cloths, the hands, the apron, sometimes the floor around the range. It had a particular smell, not terrible, exactly, but distinctive and persistent. And the physical effort of buffing a large range to a proper shine was not inconsiderable. The ranges in the larger Victorian houses were substantial objects. They could be 4 or 5 feet wide, with multiple ovens, a water heater, several hot plates, and warming shelves. Buffing all of those surfaces, getting into all of the angles and decorative ironwork that manufacturers seemed, in that era, to believe was desirable in a kitchen appliance, that was a job that took time and effort and produced results that were noticed only in their absence. No one ever came down to the kitchen and said, "My, the range looks splendid this morning." But if it had not been done, if the range had begun to look dull, or if rust had been allowed to develop at the edges, or if the ash had not been cleared and the fire had consequently been slow to draw, then that would have been noticed. That would have been mentioned, probably more than once and probably not kindly. This is the particular quality of domestic service that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it runs through everything we are going to talk about tonight. The work of servants was, almost by definition, the work of making things disappear, making problems disappear, making mess disappear, making the evidence of human habitation disappear, making the sheer labor of maintaining a house disappear. The ideal servant, the ideal Victorian servant, as imagined by the household manuals and the employers who wrote letters of recommendation and the etiquette books that sold in enormous quantities throughout the 19th century, was someone who was always there when needed and never there when not. Someone who left no trace of themselves. Someone whose presence was felt entirely through its effects and not at all through any direct encounter. You can see, perhaps, why that was a rather complicated thing to be, but let us stay in the kitchen for a little while longer, because there are more rituals here, more quiet and methodical tasks that belong to the very early morning. Once the range was cleaned and laid with paper and kindling and coal, and once the fire had caught, which could take some coaxing, particularly on cold mornings when the chimney drew badly, or when the coal was damp, or when the wind was coming from a direction that created a back draft, the kettles had to be filled. Water in a Victorian house, even a reasonably prosperous one, was not necessarily as straightforward to access as we might assume. Many larger houses had their own wells, and while houses built from the mid-19th century onward were increasingly likely to have indoor plumbing of some kind, the nature of that plumbing varied enormously. In some houses, cold water was piped to the kitchen and scullery, but not to the upper floors. In others, a single cold water tap served the entire kitchen operation, and hot water had to be carried wherever it was needed. In still others, particularly older country houses that had been built before the era of indoor plumbing and had been only partially retrofitted, water came from a pump in the yard or from a cistern in the cellar, and getting it to the kitchen was a matter of carrying it yourself. The earliest morning task in many houses was therefore the carrying of water, heavy cans or copper jugs or wooden buckets, filled at whatever source was available, carried to the kitchen, set on the range to heat. And this water was needed for many things. For the morning tea, that was one of the first things the upper housemaid prepared for herself and her colleagues before the family's morning tea had to be started. For the hot water that would be taken upstairs in large cans to be poured into the washstands in the family's rooms. For the morning's cooking. For the washing of yesterday's dishes, if that had not been done the night before. In the very largest houses, there would have been a separate water-carrying servant, or rather, this task would have been distributed among the lower servants as a shared responsibility. In smaller houses, and we should be careful throughout tonight, not to assume that every Victorian household was a grand country estate, because most were not. This would all have been the work of one or two women, doing everything simultaneously, managing multiple tasks at once, fitting them together with the kind of quiet expertise that is never written about in history books because it never seemed worth writing about. Shall we talk about the fires now? Because the fires are important. The fires are, in many ways, the defining task of the early morning for the housemaids. And when I say housemaids, I should perhaps be clearer. In a well-staffed Victorian house, there would typically have been several levels of housemaid. The head housemaid who managed the others, the under-housemaids who did the more physically demanding work, and in the largest establishments, housemaids of various intermediate descriptions who had specific duties related to specific parts of the house. The kitchen work was the cook's domain and perhaps the scullery maid's, but the fires throughout the rest of the house, in the dining room, the drawing room, the library, the study, the morning room, the bedrooms, those were the housemaid's responsibility, and they had to be laid and lit before the family got up. Every one of them. The typical large Victorian house had an enormous number of fireplaces. This is not an exaggeration. A house of any standing would have had fireplaces in virtually every room, not just for warmth, but because the fireplace was considered an essential feature of a properly furnished room, in the same way that we might consider adequate lighting an essential feature today. There were fireplaces in the drawing room, sometimes more than one in a very long room. There was a fireplace in the dining room, in the library, in the morning room, in the study, in the master bedroom, in the mistress's dressing room. In the guest bedrooms, sometimes in the nursery, sometimes in the schoolroom, in houses of the very grandest kind in the entrance hall itself. All of these fires needed to be cleaned and relayed every morning. The process was in structure similar to what we have already described with the kitchen range, though without the black leading. The cold ash from the previous day's fire had to be removed. The hearth had to be swept clean. The grate had to be polished, usually with a black lead paste similar to that used on the kitchen range, though sometimes with a different compound depending on the material of the grate. The fire had to be laid, paper first, then kindling, then coal, with attention paid to the particular characteristics of each fireplace, because every fireplace in a house of any age had its own personality, its own quirks, its own tendency to draw well or poorly depending on the wind direction and the weather and some indefinable quality of the chimney itself. And this had to be done quietly. This is the key thing. This had to be done in the very early morning in a house full of sleeping people, and it had to be done without waking anyone. The housemaid moved through the house like a ghost. Her footsteps were soft because she learned to walk softly because she had to. She opened and closed doors with a particular careful slowness. She carried her tools, the ash pail, the brush, the small coal scuttle, held close to her body so that they would not knock against the door frames. She worked by candlelight or by the thin early light coming through the windows rather than by lamp, because a lamp was harder to manage and carried more risk of smoke or spillage. She was, in a very real sense, trying not to exist, trying to move through the house and leave it transformed, warm, clean, ready, without anyone having any direct evidence that she had been there at all. There is a phrase that appears in several household manuals from this period. The phrase is invisible service. It comes up in different forms and in different contexts, but the core idea is consistent. The best domestic service is the service that the employing family does not have to think about. The service that happens around them, beneath them, behind the scenes of their daily life, reliably and without drama and without requiring their attention. This sounds, when you read it in a manual or a letter of the period, like a compliment, and in a certain narrow sense, it is. It means the service is so good that it requires no oversight, no management, no intervention. Everything simply works. But think about it from the other direction for a moment. Think about what it means to spend your working life trying to be invisible, to do work that is valued precisely because it is not seen. To maintain a house that presents itself, to the family who lives in it, as effortlessly clean and warm and orderly, when the truth is that the cleanliness is the result of hours of kneeling on stone floors, with a brush and a pail of cold water, and the warmth is the result of someone getting up in the dark at 5 a.m. to lay fires in a dozen rooms. And the orderliness is maintained by a continuous invisible labor that never quite ends and never quite produces a result that can be pointed to and said to be finished. Domestic work in the Victorian era, particularly the work of the lower servants, was not just physically demanding. It was epistemically strange. You worked all day at tasks that existed to erase the evidence of previous days' work. You cleaned things that would be dirty again tomorrow. You laid fires that would be ash again by evening. You polished surfaces that would be dusty by the following morning. The work was cyclical in a way that made progress in any conventional sense essentially impossible to measure. And yet here they were, every morning before dawn, doing it again. There is something I find genuinely moving about that, I'll admit, not in a mournful way exactly, in a quiet, respectful way. The sheer persistence of it, the sheer dailiness of it, the work went on. The morning begins, and what was done before anyone noticed by 6 o'clock in the morning, in a well-run Victorian house, a great deal had already happened. The kitchen range was clean and burning. The kettle was on. The fires in the main reception rooms had been laid, and some of them lit the dining room first, usually, since breakfast would be served there, and a cold dining room was considered both uncomfortable and somehow indicative of poor household management, regardless of the season. The front doorstep had, in many houses, already been scrubbed. The brass knocker and letterbox had been polished. The boot room had been visited, and the family's footwear from the previous day had been cleaned and arranged in their customary order. That last one is worth pausing on for a moment. Cleaning boots. It was the job, in a household with a male servant, of the hall boy or the footman. In a household without a male servant, which was, in fact, the majority of Victorian households, since the employment of male servants carried additional tax implications in Britain, and male servants generally expected higher wages than female ones, it was the job of whichever lower servant could be most conveniently assigned to it. Often enough, it was simply the general servant, the maid of all work, added to the list of morning tasks that had to be completed before the household came to life. Cleaning boots in the Victorian era was not what we would now consider cleaning boots. We tend to think of shoe cleaning as a reasonably quick operation. A damp cloth for mud, a small amount of polish, a brush, perhaps 2 minutes per shoe. Done. Move on. Victorian boot cleaning was a more elaborate and time-consuming affair, and it was elaborate partly because the standards applied to it were quite specific, and partly because the variety of footwear in a large household was considerable. There were the master's outdoor boots, which would have been used the previous day for walking or riding and would likely be dirty. There were his indoor shoes. There were the mistress's various shoes and boots, and a woman of the upper middle class in the 1870s or 1880s might easily have a dozen or more pairs of footwear, each suited to a particular occasion. There were the children's boots if there were children. There were the guests' boots if there were guests. And the cleaning was done with a mixture of preparations, some commercial, some home-prepared, whose exact composition varied by household and by period. Bone black was used as a base for some preparations, lamp black for others. There were solutions made with beer or vinegar or egg white. There were commercial preparations with names like Day and Martin's, which was one of the most popular boot polishes of the Victorian era and was sold in small stone pots with distinctive black labeling. The process for leather boots generally involved removing the dried mud first, if there was mud, which there generally was, with a stiff brush, taking care not to scratch the leather. Then the boot had to be conditioned, usually with a small amount of fat or oil worked into the leather to prevent cracking. Then the blacking or polish was applied. Then it was buffed. And then, if the household was particularly exacting, it was buffed again. Patent leather was a different problem. Patent leather was extremely fashionable throughout much of the Victorian period. It was used for formal footwear, for the toes of dress shoes, for the boots that were worn to evening functions, and it required quite different treatment. It could not be polished in the same way. The chemical composition of the lacquered surface meant that conventional blacking would damage it. The standard treatment involved cleaning it with a damp cloth, sometimes with a small amount of milk, which sounds extremely strange but was a genuinely recommended technique, and then buffing it to a shine with a very soft cloth. There was also the cleaning of indoor shoes, the lighter pumps and slippers that were changed into for evening wear or for wear within the house. These were often made of silk or satin or other delicate materials that could be damaged by conventional cleaning methods and required their own specific approaches. The point of all this is not to overwhelm you with the details of Victorian footwear maintenance, though I hope it paints a reasonably specific picture. The point is that what looks from the outside like a simple domestic task, cleaning the boots, was actually a complex, time-consuming, materials-intensive operation that required knowledge, care, and a certain amount of physical effort, and that had to be completed invisibly before the family got up. The boots were simply there, clean, in their proper places, as if by magic. Let us go upstairs for a moment, not to the family's bedrooms, not yet. Let us go to that particular zone of the Victorian house that existed, in a sense, between worlds. The first floor landing, the corridor that connected the family's rooms, the space that had to be perfectly maintained, perfectly quiet, and yet which was moved through constantly by servants in the very early morning. In the large Victorian house, the corridor cleaning, the dusting, the sweeping, the polishing of the floor happened early, very early, before the family stirred. The carpets, if there were carpets, had to be swept with a carpet brush. The mechanical carpet sweeper had been invented in the 1850s by Melville Bissell, though it did not become truly commonplace until somewhat later, and many households continued to use the traditional long-handled brush throughout the latter half of the century. The floorboards on either side of the carpet runner had to be polished. The wooden balustrade had to be dusted. The gas lamps or oil lamps in the corridor had to be trimmed and cleaned and refilled. The lamp trimming was a daily task in any house that had not yet been converted to electric lighting, which meant, for most of the Victorian period, virtually every house. Gas lamps needed their mantles inspected and replaced when necessary, their glass shades cleaned of the smoky residue that accumulated with use. Oil lamps needed their wicks trimmed. A wick that was too long produced a smoky, uneven flame and deposited black soot on the glass chimney. A wick that was too short produced a dim and insufficient light. The glass chimneys of the oil lamps needed to be washed regularly with very hot soapy water to remove the residue. The brass or silver parts needed to be polished. And again, all of this had to be done before the family was aware of any activity at all. I find myself thinking, as I describe all of this, about the physical space of the Victorian house from the servant's point of view. We tend to think of Victorian interiors as being rather imposing, all that wood paneling, all those heavy curtains, all that elaborate ornament. And from the family's perspective, from the perspective of someone who lived in those rooms as a permanent inhabitant, that impression is probably accurate. But from the servant's perspective, the house looked rather different. The servant moved through the house primarily in service corridors and back staircases that were, architecturally speaking, the bones of the house, the structural framework that was hidden behind the decorative plasterwork in mahogany and velvet. The back staircase was narrow and steep and plain. The service corridor was stone-flagged and low-ceilinged. The kitchen was often below ground level, lit by small windows high up in the walls. The servants' sleeping quarters, the attic rooms, the rooms above the stable yard, In some large houses, the separate servants' wing were small and cold and simply furnished. The servants' experience of the house was essentially the experience of its infrastructure: the pipes and drains, the coal cellars, the stone passages, the narrow service doors that opened into the polished and carpeted main rooms like secret passages. The servants moved through a parallel house, a planar house, a house that existed to service the house the family lived in, and they did so with a specific kind of bodily knowledge that is rarely discussed. They knew where the floor creaked. They knew which door needed to be lifted slightly on its hinge to open silently. They knew which stair tread was loose and could catch a foot in the dark. They knew the geography of the house in a darkness that was entirely real, because they moved through it in actual darkness, or near darkness, at hours when candles were precious and light was something to be conserved. This was not something they were necessarily taught. It was something they learned through daily practice over months and years. A new servant would, in the early weeks, make small mistakes, a noise here, a knocked object there. An experienced servant moved through the house's darkness as confidently as a cat. There were, in the larger Victorian households, certain early morning rituals that were so specific and so detailed that they read, from our contemporary perspective, almost like religious observances. Rituals with their own particular tools, their own sequence of steps, their own standards of completion that were understood and recognized by anyone who knew what they were looking at. One of the most interesting of these was the cleaning of the silver. Not all of it every morning. That would have been impractical even in the most elaborately staffed household. But the silver that would be used for breakfast, the toast rack, the coffee pot, the cream jug, the sugar bowl, the salt cellars, had to be polished before breakfast was served. And the standard of that polishing was not casual. Victorian silver cleaning was a ritual with its own materials, its own vocabulary, its own professional standards. The basic material was a paste or powder made from powdered chalk mixed with alcohol. Gin was sometimes used in earlier periods, though commercial preparations became more standard as the century progressed, applied to the silver with a soft cloth, worked in with circular motions, allowed to dry to a fine white crust, and then buffed off with a separate clean cloth to reveal the shine beneath. This sounds simple. In practice, the difficulty lay in the details. Silver tarnishes. It tarnishes because of the sulfur compounds present in the air. In certain foods, eggs are particularly notorious for producing tarnish on silver, and in certain materials it comes into contact with. In a busy household, silver tarnished quickly. The question for the silversmith, and for the housemaid responsible for the silver, was how to maintain a shine without causing damage. Too much polishing removes a small amount of silver with each application. Abrasive preparations, and some of the preparations available in the Victorian period were quite abrasive, could scratch the surface. Certain polishing motions were better than others, and an experienced servant knew the difference. There was also the question of form. A heavy Georgian candelabra, with all its detailing and ornamentation, required different treatment than a plain modern teapot. The polish had to be worked into the crevices of the decoration and then removed completely, because polish left in the crevices of ornamental silver looked dreadful and was the kind of thing an employer noticed. The plain surfaces had to shine without streaks or fingerprints. The butler, in a large house, was typically responsible for the care of the household silver. This was one of his most important responsibilities, and his skill with silver, or lack of it, was one of the primary things by which his professional competence was judged. In smaller households, The responsibility fell to whoever was in charge of the dining room. But here is a detail that I find quietly telling about the nature of Victorian domestic service. The butler typically cleaned the silver in private. Not because there was anything secretive about the process. The cleaning methods were entirely conventional, the materials widely available and unremarkable. He did it in private, usually in a small room adjacent to the pantry, called the silver room or the plate room, which was kept locked when he was not in it, because the silver was the household's most valuable portable property, and the responsibility for it was specifically and formally his. But also because the process of cleaning silver was considered slightly undignified, in the sense that it was physical, manual labor, and the butler occupied a position in the domestic hierarchy that was supposed to transcend mere physical labor. So he did it early in his private room, before the household was fully active, and by the time anyone of standing was moving around the house, the silver was clean and polished and in its proper place, and the process by which it had got that way was, once again, invisible. The butler managed the invisible labor of managing invisibility. There is something almost poetic about that. The language of the bells, communication in the Victorian house. Let us talk about the bells. Because the bell system in a Victorian house is one of those things that looks, on first examination, like a simple convenience, a practical piece of technology that allowed the family to summon servants without shouting, and that turns out, on closer examination, to be the central nervous system of the entire domestic operation. A technology that organized time, arranged hierarchy, allocated work, communicated need, and expressed in its most fundamental architecture the social arrangements of the Victorian household. If you have ever visited a country house museum and seen the bell board in the servants' area, the long row of bells mounted in a wooden frame above a passage or pantry, each one labeled with the name of the room from which it could be rung, you will have some visual sense of what I am describing. Each bell was connected by a system of wires and cranks and pulleys to a bell pull in one of the family's rooms. When someone in the drawing room pulled the silk bell pull beside the fireplace, a spring mechanism was activated, the wire ran through its passage in the wall, and the corresponding bell on the board in the servants' area jangled. The housemaid heard it, or the footman, or the parlor maid, and they went. This is the simple version. The more complex version involves a set of social codes and protocols around the bells that were understood by everyone who worked or lived in the household, and that required a degree of interpretation and judgment that is not at all apparent from the mechanical simplicity of the system itself. Take, for example, the question of who rang which bell. In the well-organized Victorian household, different members of the family and different types of requests were supposed to correspond to different patterns of ringing. A single slow ring might indicate a simple request, perhaps a tray of something to be brought or a message to be carried. A quick double ring might indicate more urgency. The nature of the bell, the drawing room bell, the master's bedroom bell, the mistress's bell, indicated not just the location of the request but its likely nature, which in turn indicated which servant should respond. The drawing room bell was generally attended by the parlor maid or footman. The master's bedroom bell was attended by his valet. The mistress's bell was attended by her lady's maid. The nursery bell was attended by the nursery maid, and so on. But in households where the staffing was not quite sufficient to maintain these divisions perfectly, and that was a larger proportion of Victorian households than we might imagine, the bells had to be answered by whoever was available, whoever was not occupied with something more pressing, whoever happened to be nearest the bell board when it rang. This required a kind of domestic diplomacy, a constant assessment of who could be spared from what task, whose current responsibility was more or less deferrable. The head housemaid in the larger household was the one who made these decisions. She stood, in a sense, at the intersection of the bell board and the daily work schedule, watching both simultaneously, allocating resources. This was a management role in the most literal sense of that word, and yet it was not typically described as management or as skilled work. It was simply part of being the head housemaid. There was also the question of anticipation. The truly skilled Victorian servant was not simply one who responded quickly and efficiently to the bells. The truly skilled servant was one who anticipated the bells, who knew the household's routines well enough to have things ready before they were asked for, who understood the family's habits well enough to predict, within reasonable certainty, what would be needed next and when. This sounds, in our contemporary context, like the kind of intuitive service that we associate with the very highest end of hospitality. The hotel that brings you a fresh towel before you realize you need one. The restaurant that refills your water glass without being asked. And that instinct is not wrong. There is a direct line of descent from the skilled Victorian domestic servant to the contemporary hospitality professional. But in the Victorian context, this anticipatory quality was not a matter of hospitality industry training or customer service philosophy. It was a matter of daily survival. A servant who failed to anticipate, who was always reactive rather than proactive, who was always caught unready, who had to be reminded and prompted and rung for constantly, was a servant who would not last, who would receive poor references, who would find themselves moving down through the levels of the domestic employment market, from one house to another, each one a little smaller and less desirable than the last. So the servants learned to anticipate. They learned the family's rhythms. They learned that the master generally came down to breakfast at 8:30, that he liked his newspaper already ironed and folded. Yes, the newspaper was ironed, which we will come to, that he preferred his coffee hot and poured rather than placed on the table in a pot. They learned that the mistress would ring for her maid at about 8:15, and that she preferred her morning chocolate to have been sitting in the warmer for at least 10 minutes before it was brought to her. They learned the children's routines, the governess's habits, the particular preferences of the guests who stayed with any regularity. They held all of this knowledge in their heads. There were no written manuals for the specific household, or rather, there might have been in the most organized establishments a household book maintained by the housekeeper, but this was a document for the housekeeper's reference, not the general staff's. Everyone else carried the knowledge as tacit understanding, accumulated through experience and never quite formalized. This accumulated knowledge, the knowledge of the household, of its routines, of its members' preferences and habits and idiosyncrasies, was one of the most valuable things a servant possessed, and it was, interestingly, entirely non-transferable. The knowledge was specific to this household. When you moved to a new position, you started again from nothing. You had to relearn all of it, the rhythm of the new bells, the particular habits of the new family, the specific geography of a new house, the new set of creaking floorboards and drafty corridors and temperamental fireplaces, which perhaps explains why, in accounts of Victorian domestic service written by servants themselves, and there are more of these than you might expect, a recurring theme is the way in which a specific household came to feel like something very close to home. Not in a sentimental or uncomplicated sense, not in the sense of belonging necessarily or of being entirely comfortable, but in the practical sense that a place you know intimately, whose every surface and sound and smell you have mapped through years of daily contact, becomes in some inescapable way yours. The house was not their house, of course. It was entirely, legally, economically, the employer's house, but the servants knew it in a way the employers often did not. They knew its infrastructure, its hidden passages, its mechanical systems, its failures and its peculiarities. They knew it in the dark, the ironing of the newspaper. I promised we would come to this, and we shall. It sounds, to contemporary ears, almost comically excessive, and I understand that reaction. But the reasoning behind it, once explained, makes a certain practical sense, even if the practice itself sits rather oddly with our current sensibilities. Newspapers in the Victorian era were printed with ink that dried, but not completely, fresh newsprint, and the papers were delivered fresh to the houses of the quality every morning, left traces of ink on the fingers of anyone who handled them extensively. Reading the morning paper, for a gentleman of the upper or upper middle classes, was an important daily ritual. Reading it in white gloves was not practical. Reading it and arriving at breakfast with inky fingers was, on the other hand, considered entirely unacceptable. The solution was to iron the newspaper. The ironing process, done with a warm, not hot, flat iron passed carefully over each page before folding, partially set the ink, reduced its tendency to transfer, and gave the paper a slightly crisp, formal quality that was also aesthetically valued. It was, in its way, a kind of finishing process, a final preparation of the newspaper for its proper use. It was done by the footman, or the valet, or the hall boy, early in the morning before breakfast was served. It was done every day. It added perhaps 15 or 20 minutes to the morning routine, and it left behind a slight smell of warm paper that has been described by several Victorian memoirists as one of the specific sensory markers of the well-run breakfast room. The family took their iron newspapers. They read them. They put them down. The papers were collected later, folded, and either stored for use as fire-lighting material or in households where the servants were given certain privileges, passed down to the servants' hall for reading. The ink on the family's fingers, thanks to all of this careful preparation, was minimal. Whether they thought about why that was, I rather doubt. And as the night deepens into morning, and the early gray light begins to work its way through the shutters of the upstairs rooms, let us sit for a moment with the particular atmosphere of the Victorian house at this hour. It is early still. The family has not yet come down. The servants have been at work for 2 or 3 hours already. They are not precisely tired, not yet, though the day is long and the house has been prepared. The fires are burning in the main rooms. The breakfast table has been laid. The silver gleams. The newspaper is crisp and folded. The boots are in their places. The house looks, to anyone who comes down the main staircase and enters the dining room and sits at the polished table and pours from the gleaming coffee pot, as though it has simply arranged itself, as though it exists in this state naturally. As though warmth and cleanliness and order are simply the default conditions of this particular house, maintained by some impersonal domestic law rather than by the labor of several human beings who have been up since before dawn. This is the effect that was intended. This is what a well-run Victorian house was supposed to feel like. And the fact that it felt that way, the smoothness of it, the effortlessness of the surface, is in some ways a testimony to the skill and the effort of the people who made it feel that way. And in some ways a rather complicated testimony, because what they were skilled at and what they were putting their effort into was precisely the concealment of skill and effort. They were professional vanishers. The secrets of the still room, preparations the household made in private. There was a room in the Victorian house, in the larger Victorian house, to be precise, that most guests never saw and that the household manuals discussed with great specificity, but that modern visitors to historic houses often walk past without quite understanding what it was for. It was called the still room. The name comes from an earlier era, from the word distillery. In the great houses of the 16th and 17th centuries, it was the room where the lady of the house or her housekeeper would have operated the household still, producing medicinal waters and cordials and various preparations that combined what we would now separate into medicine and cooking and housekeeping. By the Victorian era, the still room had evolved considerably. It no longer typically contained an actual still, though in some of the older houses it might have done, but it remained a room for the preparation of things that were not quite cooking and not quite cleaning. It was the room where preserves were made, where cordials were prepared, where liqueurs were stored, where the housekeeper kept her various cleaning preparations, where certain medicinal compounds were mixed, where the household's supply of flavoring essences and pickling vinegars and salting preparations were produced and maintained. It was, in essence, the room where the household's more complex and specialized preparations were made, the chemistry of the house, if you like. And it was almost always the housekeeper's particular domain. The Victorian housekeeper was not simply a domestic manager. She was, in the full sense of the word, a professional. She had knowledge of food preservation, of basic chemistry, of the properties of various cleaning materials, of the management of stores, of the calculation of quantities, of the keeping of accounts. She had in many cases expertise in basic medicine, the treatment of minor ailments, the dressing of wounds, the management of the household's small medical emergencies, that would, in a rural context, have made her the primary medical resource for the servants and the outdoor staff. The still room was where much of this expertise was exercised and maintained. Let us walk through it very slowly. The room itself was typically well lit. It needed to be, for the precise work that happened in it. It had a work table, plain and scrubbed, shelves well organized with labels, a small stove or spirit lamp for warming and melting, various implements of the tradesperson's variety, funnels, straining cloths, bottles of various sizes, sealing wax, cork supplies, and the materials themselves, jars of preserves, bottles of vinegar, tins of this and that, dried herbs hanging from a beam or stored in sealed containers, various powders and compounds in smaller containers at the back of the shelves. The still room maid, a junior member of staff who worked specifically under the housekeeper's direction in this room, was responsible for the day-to-day maintenance of the still room and the routine production of certain things it prepared. She kept the room clean, she kept the shelves organized, she prepared the simpler items under the housekeeper's supervision, and she fetched and carried what was needed. The housekeeper herself supervised the more complex preparations, and these were genuinely complex. Consider, for example, the making of fruit vinegars. Fruit vinegars were used throughout the Victorian kitchen as flavoring agents, as condiment bases, as ingredients in sauces and dressings. The raspberry vinegar that appeared on Victorian breakfast tables as an accompaniment to certain dishes was not purchased in a well-run household but made. The process involved steeping fresh raspberries in wine vinegar for several days, straining the liquid, adding sugar, and then heating and bottling the result. Done correctly, it produced a clear, dark red liquid with a sharp, sweet, intensely fruited quality. Done incorrectly, if the vinegar was poor quality, or the proportion of sugar was wrong, or the steeping time was misjudged, it produced something muddy and thin and disappointing. The housekeeper knew the difference. She had made raspberry vinegar dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. She knew the precise color the liquid should be at the straining stage. She knew how to test the proportion of sugar by taste. She knew the particular quality of good wine vinegar versus poor. She knew, in other words, how to do it properly, and properly was not a loose standard. There was another category of still room preparation that I find particularly interesting, because it represents a kind of knowledge that has almost entirely disappeared from general domestic practice. This was the preparation of cleaning materials. We are so accustomed, in the contemporary world, to the idea that cleaning materials come in bottles from a shop, bottles with brand names and specific chemical formulations and safety warnings and instructions, that we have almost entirely lost the idea that cleaning materials could be made at home. That making them was, for most of human history and well into the Victorian era, simply part of domestic management. And these were not simple preparations. Take, for example, the making of furniture cream. Commercial furniture polishes existed in the Victorian period. They were advertised in household journals and available from ironmongers, but many households, particularly the larger and more self-sufficient ones, made their own. The basic ingredients were beeswax, turpentine, and sometimes a small amount of oil. But the exact proportions, the method of combining them, the additions that might be made for different purposes, a harder cream for highly polished mahogany, a softer cream for oak, a preparation with a slight color for filling small scratches in dark wood, these were matters of knowledge and skill. The housekeeper's still room book, a manuscript book kept by many housekeepers, containing their personal accumulation of recipes and preparations and formulas, would typically contain dozens of these preparations. Preparations for leather, for brass, for copper, for pewter, for stone floors, for fabric, for removing stains of various kinds. Each one the product of experimentation and experience, accumulated over years, passed down from one housekeeper to the next in some cases, invented fresh in others. There were preparations for removing candle wax from carpet, preparations for treating the rust spots that developed on white linen, preparations for cleaning gilded picture frames without damaging the gilding, preparations for treating the mildew that developed on stored fabrics in damp houses. Preparations for dealing with the particular stains produced by the various things that were eaten and drunk in the Victorian household: wine, port, ink, gravy, berry jams. The stain removal knowledge of the Victorian housekeeper was, in particular, extraordinarily specific, because laundry, the laundering of the household's clothing and linen, was one of the most labor-intensive and consequential operations of the domestic year, and stain removal was a critical part of the laundering process. A stain that had not been treated correctly before washing might be set permanently by the hot water. A stain that had been incorrectly treated might be made worse. Getting it right mattered, not just aesthetically but economically. Household linens were expensive, and a good set of table linen represented a meaningful investment that had to be protected. The housekeeper knew the chemistry of stains, empirically if not theoretically. She knew that fruit stains had to be treated with cold water, not hot, because heat would set them. That ink stains required one treatment, blood stains another, grease stains another entirely. that some stains responded to acid treatments, lemon juice, certain vinegars, and others to alkali treatments, lye, certain soaps, that the color and weave of the fabric mattered, as different treatments that were safe for white linen might damage colored silk. This is real chemistry. It is applied chemistry, pragmatic chemistry, chemistry without formal theory, but the results were achieved by the same underlying principles that a laboratory chemist would have recognized. The Victorian housekeeper did not know about pH or about the chemical structure of tannins and proteins, but she knew what worked. And that knowledge, accumulated over decades of domestic practice and passed from experienced to inexperienced servants through direct demonstration, was genuine knowledge. I want to tell you about a specific preparation that I found mentioned in several Victorian household management texts, because I think it illustrates something important about the nature of the still room work and the housekeeper's role. The preparation was called Fuller's Earth Treatment, and it was used for the cleaning of fine woolen fabrics. Fuller's Earth is a naturally occurring clay mineral. It is actually the same material that was historically used in the fulling of wool, the industrial process of cleaning and thickening freshly woven cloth, hence the name. It has a remarkable affinity for oils and greases. It absorbs them extremely efficiently, and it was used in the domestic context as a dry cleaning treatment for fabrics that could not safely be wetted. The process was not quick. Fine woolen garments, a good quality dress, for example, or a gentleman's frock coat, would be laid out flat on a clean surface. Fuller's Earth in a fine powder would be sprinkled generously over the fabric. Then the garment would be carefully rolled or folded and left for a period, often overnight, sometimes for 24 hours, to allow the earth to absorb the grease. Then the earth would be carefully brushed out with a soft brush and the garment examined. If done correctly, the grease marks would be substantially reduced or eliminated. The fabric would look and smell fresher, but the process required judgment. Too little earth or too short a time and the stains would not fully absorb. Too vigorous a brushing and the fabric could be damaged. The housekeeper or the lady's maid dealing with fine garments knew from experience exactly how much to use, how long to leave it, how firmly to brush. And this knowledge was maintained and transmitted within the household. It was not written on the tin of Fuller's Earth. It was not in a manual that could be purchased. It was in the hands and the memory of the people who did the work. There is something I find rather beautiful about this, actually. About the idea that within the physical fabric of the Victorian house, within the routines and the rituals and the careful daily practices of its servants, there was this accumulated body of practical knowledge, entirely specific, entirely experiential, entirely unmeasured by any external standard, that kept the household functioning at a level of material comfort and presentation that its inhabitants took entirely for granted. It is knowledge that, in most cases, left no record. Most still-room books were thrown away. Most housekeepers' notes were never preserved. The knowledge simply disappeared, along with the way of life that had created it. What survives is fragmentary, a household manual here, a memoir there, an occasional reference in a letter. But for the purposes of tonight, we can try to reconstruct a little of it. Laundry, the Monday ritual and its elaborate World Monday was Laundry Day. In most Victorian households of any size, laundry was done on a fixed weekly cycle, and Monday was generally the day on which the washing was begun. This was not arbitrary. The logic behind it was practical. Beginning the wash on Monday meant that the majority of the work, the heavy washing and wringing, would be done early in the week. leaving the ironing and finishing work for later days, and ensuring that the household's linen was refreshed and returned to circulation by Wednesday or Thursday at the latest. The preparation for Monday's washing actually began the previous Saturday evening. On Saturday, the soiled linen was collected from the house, from the bedrooms, the dining room, the kitchen, and sorted in the laundry room. This sorting was itself a skilled operation. Whites were separated from coloreds. Cotton was separated from wool and silk and linen, because different fabrics required different washing methods and different temperatures. Very delicate items, fine lace, embroidered handkerchiefs, certain pieces of dress fabric, were separated into a special category that would be handled individually rather than thrown into the general wash. And before the washing could begin at all, the worst stains had to be identified and pre-treated. We have talked about stain treatment already in the context of the still room. But the Monday morning stain treatment was different from the housekeeper's more elaborate preparations. This was the hands-on, item-by-item assessment that the laundry maid did early Monday morning before anything went into the wash, rubbing certain stains with a mixture of ox gall and water, treating certain others with a preparation of hartshorn and chalk, applying lemon juice and salt to iron mold stains on white linen, and then laying the piece out in direct sunlight, which was found empirically to help bleach out the stain, though no one in 1870 would have been able to explain precisely why. The early Monday morning in the laundry smelled of hot water and soap and something slightly alkaline, the smell of lye or potash soap that was the primary cleaning agent of the Victorian wash. The copper, the large copper vessel, built into a range or heated over a fire, that was the central piece of equipment in any laundry, had to be filled with water and heated. In larger houses, there might be 2 or 3 coppers. In smaller houses, just one, which would be used multiple times through the day. The water for the copper had to be carried in the houses where it was not piped to the laundry. This was heavy work. The copper itself, when full, held a substantial volume of water, and keeping it hot through the day required continuous attention to the fire beneath it. The white linen went in first. It was boiled. Boiling the whites, submerging white cotton and linen items in water that was hot enough to sterilize as well as clean, was the standard treatment for the household's most important and most conspicuous laundry. The white tablecloths, the white bed sheets, the white shirt fronts, the white aprons and caps that formed part of the servant's uniform. These were the items by which the household's cleanliness was publicly judged. The gleaming white tablecloth at a Victorian dinner table was, in a quite specific social sense, a statement. A statement about the household's standards, its prosperity, its management. Getting that white was not accidental. It was the result of boiling and washing and rinsing and bluing and starching and ironing, a sequence of operations that took the better part of a day and that produced, at the end, a result that looked as though it had simply emerged from the linen press already perfect. Bluing. Bluing is one of those Victorian laundry practices that is fascinating partly because it is counterintuitive until you understand the optics behind it. White fabric that has been washed repeatedly tends, over time, to acquire a yellowish cast. This yellowing is partly the result of the oils and proteins that have been absorbed into the fabric from contact with the human body. It is also partly an optical effect. Completely pure white fabric actually reflects all wavelengths of light more or less equally, which does not necessarily appear the brightest white to the human eye, because the human visual system interprets the slight bluish tinge of skylight as neutral. By adding a very small amount of blue dye, Prussian blue, in some formulations, or synthetic ultramarine, or later in the century commercial products called blue that came in small bags or balls to the final rinse water, the yellowish cast was optically counteracted. The blue subtracted the yellow. The result to the eye appeared whiter than either pure white or pure yellow would have done. This is real optical physics, applied empirically by laundry maids who had never heard of color theory and who knew simply that the bluing made the sheets look better. The starching was another matter entirely. Starch made from arrowroot or potato starch or wheat starch, depending on the household's preferences and resources, was applied to certain items to give them a particular stiffness and finish. Shirt fronts and collars and cuffs were heavily starched, giving them the rigid, sculptural quality that was fashionable for formal dress throughout much of the Victorian period. Table linen received lighter starching, which helped it lay flat on the table and gave it a slight crispness. Certain household items, antimacassars, tray cloths, various decorative linens, were sometimes lightly starched as well. The application of starch was not simply a matter of dipping the item in a solution. The concentration of the starch mattered. Too heavy and the item became board stiff, which might crack the fabric on ironing and which looked, frankly, unnatural. Too light and the desired effect was not achieved, and different items required different concentrations. The same starch solution that was appropriate for a gentleman's collar was entirely too heavy for a fine linen handkerchief. The ironing of starched items also required specific skill. A starch-coated fabric, if ironed at the wrong temperature, produced a brownish scorched mark that ruined the item entirely. If ironed at too low a temperature, the starch did not properly bond and the finish was poor. The right temperature, which the experienced laundress assessed by holding the iron near her face to feel the heat, or by touching it briefly with a damp finger to judge its sizzle, produced the distinctive smooth, slightly glossy surface that was the hallmark of well-ironed starched linen. All of this happened every week without exception. In the heat and steam of the laundry, with its permanent cloud of soapy moisture and the steady sound of water heating and fabrics being lifted and turned and wrung, the household's linens were transformed from used to fresh, from worn to perfect, from intimate to presentable. I want to stay with the laundry for a little while longer because there is one aspect of it that I think is particularly worth understanding, and that is the sheer physical labor involved. We have somewhat lost, in the contemporary world, the sense of how physically demanding large-scale hand laundry was. We do our laundry by placing things in a machine, pressing a button, and returning some time later. The physical effort required is minimal. The physical effort required by the Victorian laundry maid was anything but. Consider the wringing of wet sheets. A wet sheet, a full-sized bed sheet made of heavy cotton or linen, is an extraordinarily heavy object when thoroughly wet. Wringing it by hand to remove sufficient water for it to be manageable, without the assistance of any mechanical device, requires considerable upper body strength, sustained over a period of time. In larger households, the heaviest items might be wrung by two people together. In smaller ones, a single laundry maid managed alone. The washboards, ridged boards against which items were rubbed in the tub of hot soapy water, required sustained physical effort. The lifting of items in and out of the copper required care not to burn oneself, and strength to manage heavy wet fabrics at high temperature. The carrying of water, the management of the fires, the moving of heavy tubs, all of this was physical in a way that few contemporary occupations match. By midday on Monday, the laundry maid was quite simply tired, and yet the work was not done. The ironing, which might spread over Tuesday and into Wednesday, was no less physically demanding in its own way. The irons were heavy, and they had to be kept hot by constant return to the fire, and the motion of ironing, the pressing and smoothing and precision work, was fatiguing in the particular way that sustained, careful physical labor is. And then the following Monday, it began again. There are memoirs from this period, written by women who had worked as laundry maids, or who had been domestic servants in households where they took turns with the laundry, that describe this weekly cycle with a kind of resigned accuracy that is entirely lacking in sentimentality. It was hard work. It was honest about being hard work. And yet there was also, in some of these accounts, a specific pride in the outcome, a pride in the whiteness of the sheets, the crispness of the collars, the way the iron tablecloths lay without a wrinkle. A craftsman's pride, essentially, in work done to a high standard. This is perhaps worth holding onto. Above and below, the invisible management of the household's two worlds, there is a phrase that comes up repeatedly in Victorian writing about domestic service, and the phrase is the green baize door. The green baize door was the door present in virtually all larger Victorian houses, and in many smaller ones, that separated the family's part of the house from the servant's part. It was typically covered in baize, a coarse woolen fabric, which served both a practical and a symbolic function. Practically, the baize provided sound dampening. The noises of the kitchen and the servants' hall, the clatter of pots and footsteps on stone floors, and the conversations of the domestic staff were muffled by the door and did not reach the family's rooms. Symbolically, the door marked a boundary. Beyond it was the family's world, quiet, clean, properly furnished, maintained in the standards appropriate to the household's social position. On this side of it was the working world, noisier, plainer, more functional. The family crossed this door rarely or never. The servants crossed it multiple times a day, in both directions, carrying the materials and the results of their work from one world to the other. But it is not quite accurate to say that the door simply separated two worlds. Because in the operation of the Victorian house, the two worlds were intimately connected, and the connection between them was precisely what made the whole thing work. Let us think about what the servants' side looked like. The kitchen was typically below ground level or at the back of the house, with access to the kitchen yard and the delivery entrance. Adjacent to the kitchen was the scullery, the working kitchen, the wet kitchen, where the dishes were washed and the vegetables were prepared and the less pleasant aspects of kitchen work were conducted. Beyond the scullery was often the larder, cool, north-facing, shelved, where the meat and dairy and other perishable stores were kept. There was typically a coal store close to the kitchen, because the coal supply for the kitchen range had to be constantly replenished. There might be a separate fuel store for the fires in the upper rooms. The butler's pantry was close to the dining room, or had access to it. It needed to be, because the butler's primary operating space was in service of the dining room. The plate room was adjacent to or part of the butler's pantry, locked, where the silver was stored. The wine cellar was the butler's other primary domain, below ground, cool, orderly, with its various bins and racks organized by wine type and vintage. The housekeeper's room was typically near the still room. It served as her office and sitting room, the place where she kept her household book and her personal accounts, and where she had private consultations with the cook about the week's menus or with the tradespeople who supplied the household. In larger establishments, the housekeeper's room was where the upper servants, the lady's maid, the cook, the butler, the head housemaid, had their meals separately from the lower servants, who ate in the servants' hall. This division within the servant world, between upper and lower servants, is one of those aspects of Victorian domestic life that surprises people who haven't studied it closely. Because the servant world was itself hierarchically organized, and the hierarchy was maintained with a seriousness that was essentially a mirror of the hierarchy it served. The butler and the housekeeper occupied, in the servant hierarchy, positions roughly analogous to the master and mistress of the house in the upper hierarchy. They were addressed formally. They had their own space. Their authority over the lower servants was real and generally unquestioned. They did not typically perform the most physically demanding tasks themselves. Those were for the lower servants, but they managed, supervised, directed, and were held accountable for the work of those beneath them. The cook occupied a somewhat autonomous position. Cooking was a skilled profession, and a good cook was genuinely difficult to replace, which gave her a degree of independence that most servants did not enjoy. Good cooks were, throughout the Victorian period, in constant demand, and they knew it. They could be, and often were, somewhat exacting in their management of their own domain. The kitchen was the cook's, not the housekeeper's, despite any theoretical organizational chart that might have suggested otherwise. The lady's maid occupied another particular position in the hierarchy. She worked closely with the mistress of the house, more closely, in some cases, than any other servant. She helped with her dressing and undressing, with the care of her clothes and jewelry, with her personal grooming. She might accompany the mistress when she traveled. She was privy to conversations and personal matters that other servants were not. This intimacy gave her a certain status, but it was a status that was in some ways isolating. She was neither entirely part of the upper servant world nor entirely part of the lower servant world, but occupied a slightly uncertain position between them. Let us talk now about something that the household manuals discuss at considerable length, and that has always struck me as one of the most psychologically interesting aspects of Victorian domestic service. It is the question of how servants were expected to behave in the presence of the family. There were, broadly speaking, two competing models. The first model, the one that was dominant in the earlier Victorian period and in the most formal establishments, held that servants should be effectively invisible when in the presence of the family. That they should carry out their work without speaking unless spoken to, without making eye contact unless invited, without any expression or reaction that suggested they were paying attention to the family's conversation or activities beyond what was strictly necessary for the performance of their duties. This model required, if you think about it, a quite extraordinary act of social performance. The servant entering the dining room to clear plates was, in this model, supposed to be functionally equivalent to a piece of furniture that moved. They were in the room, they were performing actions, but they were not, socially speaking, present. They occupied a kind of social transparency. The second model, somewhat more prevalent in the later Victorian period and in households that were, in the parlance of the time, somewhat less formal, allowed for a degree of polite acknowledgement. The servant could respond to a direct question with something more than a minimal answer. They could accept a thank you with a thank you, ma'am, rather than a mute bob of the head. There was a thin social exchange, but even in the more relaxed model, the fundamental asymmetry was maintained. The servant did not initiate conversation. The servant did not express opinions unless specifically asked. The servant did not laugh at the family's jokes, though they might permit themselves a very slight and very controlled smile if the joke was clearly meant to include them. The servant did not display any sign of curiosity about the family's affairs, even though, as we have already noted, they knew those affairs in considerable detail. There is a term that appears in the literature of this period, studied indifference. It refers to the face and posture and expression that the well-trained servant maintained while in the presence of the family. Not blank exactly, blank could look strange or unsettling, but smooth, controlled, without apparent interior, a face from which nothing about the person wearing it could be inferred. Learning this face, this expression of studied indifference, was part of the training of a domestic servant. It was learned partly through explicit instruction, partly through observation of more experienced colleagues, and partly through the social pressure of the work itself, which quickly and reliably punished any departure from it. Because what happened if a servant failed to maintain studied indifference? If a servant was seen to be listening to the family's conversation? If a servant visibly reacted to something seen or overheard in the course of their duties? The answer, in most cases, was a reprimand. And a reprimand from an employer in the Victorian domestic servant situation was not simply an embarrassing professional moment. It was a potential threat to the servant's livelihood, to their reputation, to their ability to obtain future employment. References were everything in Victorian domestic service. A bad reference, or worse, no reference, was effectively a professional death sentence. It meant moving down the employment ladder, from one less desirable position to another, until you ended up in the worst kind of service, the kind that paid least and demanded most and offered no path upward. So the face was maintained, and behind the face, the person continued to observe and to think and to feel whatever they felt. This is the part that the household manuals never quite address. The manuals tell you a great deal about what servants were supposed to do and how they were supposed to appear. They say almost nothing about the interior experience of maintaining that appearance for 14 or 15 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, for years at a time. What do you think about when you are maintaining a face of studied indifference in a room full of people who are not thinking about you at all? Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, while the above-stairs world proceeded with its meals and its conversation and its studied obliviousness, other things were happening in the house that the family were not supposed to know about directly, even though they benefited from them constantly. Let us talk about what happened in the kitchen. Specifically, let us talk about what the cook was doing in the hours between breakfast and lunch, on a typical day in a well-managed Victorian household, because this represents a kind of orchestrated complexity that is easy to miss if you are simply looking at the finished results. The dishes that appeared on the dining table, beautifully presented, seemingly without effort. The cook, we will call her Mrs. Blaine, which is a name from the period that I rather like, though she is a composite figure rather than a specific one, had received the day's menu from the mistress, or from the housekeeper, sometime the previous day or that morning. The menu for a household of any standing would typically involve 3 or 4 courses at luncheon and 5 or 6 at dinner, with each course consisting of multiple dishes. The logistics of producing this were, to put it plainly, substantial. Different dishes required different cooking times. Some had to begin first thing in the morning, a long braised piece of meat, for example, or a stock that needed to simmer for several hours to develop its depth of flavor. Others had to begin shortly before lunch. Others, certain sauces, certain delicate preparations, had to be done at the last possible moment because their quality deteriorated with standing. Managing these overlapping timelines, with a kitchen range that had a limited number of cooking surfaces, and with the assistance of possibly one or two kitchen maids whose competence and reliability could not always be fully relied upon, was a complex logistical problem. The cook solved it, essentially, in her head. She carried the entire production schedule mentally. She knew from experience that the soup stock needed 4 hours, that the buff en daube needed 3 hours from the time it went into the oven, that the pastry for the fruit tart needed to rest for 30 minutes before rolling, that the syllabub needed to be prepared no more than an hour before serving, or it would collapse. She arranged these overlapping requirements into a sequence that used the available cooking surfaces efficiently, that accounted for the known quirks of her particular range, and that delivered everything to the table at the correct temperature and in the correct sequence. This was done without a written schedule. It was done from knowledge, from practice, from the kind of temporal and spatial intelligence that develops through long experience with a specific kind of complex work. It was, in the truest sense, skilled professional work. And yet, because it was domestic work, because it happened in the kitchen, because it was done by a woman in an apron rather than by a man in a counting house, it was not, in the social terms of the Victorian era, considered skilled professional work. It was considered housekeeping. What they kept secret, the private practices of the servants' hall. There is a wall in the Victorian house that I have not yet properly described, and it is the wall between what the servant did and what the servant let the employer see. I do not mean deception in any simple sense. I mean something more subtle and more interesting. I mean the way in which the servants, across the Victorian period and in households of all sizes, developed a set of practices, understandings, accommodations, and quiet strategies that existed in the space between the formal expectations of their employment and the practical reality of their daily lives. Some of these were entirely benign. Some were clever. Some were, by the strict standards of their employer's expectations, technically improper. And some were simply human, the kinds of accommodations that any person makes when they have to live as well as work in a confined and hierarchically ordered space. Let us begin with something relatively simple, the matter of food. In theory, the servants of a Victorian household were fed according to a specific and defined arrangement. They received their meals, breakfast, dinner, supper, in the servants' hall, prepared by the cook, or in smaller houses, by the general servant herself, from foodstuffs provided for that purpose. The quality and quantity of servants' food was a matter that household manuals addressed at length, and there was considerable variation between households in how well or poorly servants were fed. In practice, the kitchen was a place of constant production, and the line between what was produced for the family and what was available to the servants was not quite as clear in daily operation as it was in principle. Consider what happened to the trimmings. When a large joint of meat was prepared for the family's dinner, there were trimmings, odd pieces, small cuts, fatty portions, bones with meat adhering, that were the residue of the preparation process. When vegetables were prepared, there were outer leaves, stalks, and peelings that were the residue of that process. When bread was made, there was the residue of the dough that clung to the bowl and the board. These residues were not waste in the Victorian kitchen. They were resources. The bones went into the stock pot. The vegetable trimmings might go into the same stock pot or into a pot of soup for the servants' hall. The bread residues might be used in a bread pudding or in a forcemeat stuffing. The meat trimmings, depending on their character, might appear in a risole or a hash or a potted paste. The cook, in managing all of this, had a degree of discretion over how these secondary resources were used, and in that discretion there was a small degree of informal power. A good cook, one who was respected by the servants under her in the kitchen, might ensure that the servants' hall table was well provisioned from these secondary resources. A cold meat pie made from the trimmings of yesterday's joint. A rich vegetable soup made from the vegetable preparation residues. These things did not appear on the official menu in the household accounts. They were the cook's management of the kitchen's economics. Was this permitted? The household manuals tended to be somewhat vague on the precise boundaries. The formal expectation was that the employer's household provided a defined set of meals for the servants. The informal reality was that a kitchen in continuous production generated resources that could be used in multiple ways, and the cook's management of those resources was, in practice, largely unseen by the employing family. There was another practice that was widespread, somewhat more sensitive, and discussed with considerable discretion in the contemporary literature. This was the matter of vails. A vail was a tip, a gratuity given to servants by visitors to the household for services rendered during the visit. The system of vails had been a standard feature of upper-class English household management since the 17th century, and it persisted well into the Victorian period, though with increasing ambivalence from employers and increasingly organized resistance from the more reform-minded elements of society. When a gentleman came to stay at a country house for the weekend, or for a week during the shooting season, or for whatever occasion had brought him there, he was expected on departure to tip the servants who had waited on him, the footman who had cleaned his boots and pressed his clothes, the housemaid who had kept his room, the butler who had ensured his comfort at dinner. These tips could, in aggregate, represent a meaningful supplement to the relatively modest wages that servants received as their formal compensation. The system was, from the servant's perspective, genuinely important, but it was also complex and occasionally awkward. The amount expected was not fixed. It varied by the wealth and social position of the visitor, by the quality of the service they had received, and by a set of informal conventions that were widely understood but never formally codified. Too small a tip was insulting, and the word would get around. Too large a tip might seem strange, or might create a particular expectation for future visits. The wrong amount in the wrong context, a guest who tipped the butler but not the footman, or who tipped one housemaid but forgot another, could produce resentment. Employers had mixed feelings about the vail system. On one hand, it supplemented their servants' wages with funds that the employers themselves did not have to provide directly, which had an obvious financial advantage. On the other hand, the system created a set of incentive structures that did not always align with the employer's interests. A servant who was focused on impressing and pleasing visiting guests might, consciously or unconsciously, prioritize the needs and preferences of those guests over the standing instructions of the household. The vail system also created, within the servants' world, a secondary economy that was not fully visible to the employer, and vails were not the only element of this secondary economy. There were also perquisites, perks, in the modern shortening of the word. These were the traditional entitlements of servants to certain secondary benefits of their position. The wax and tallow ends from the household's candles, which had a cash value and could be sold. The dripping from the kitchen roasting, the fat that collected beneath roasting meat, which could similarly be sold or used. certain types of used tea leaves, which could be dried and sold on the household's old newspapers, which went to various uses. These perquisites were traditional, long established, recognized, not quite official, but so well established as to be effectively part of the compensation package. The employers knew about perquisites in general. They did not necessarily know precisely what volume of perquisites was being accumulated and disposed of in any given month. This was part of the invisible economy of the household, the secondary layer of material benefit that moved below the level of the formal accounts. And there were, of course, occasional more significant departures from strict rectitude, servants who helped themselves, quietly, to a small amount of the employer's wine or spirits, servants who put small quantities of dry goods into their pockets, servants who, in the course of purchasing provisions for the household, received a small commission from the tradespeople they dealt with, a practice that was widespread, almost universal, and that the household manuals consistently condemned without ever quite succeeding in eliminating. I want to be careful here not to present this simply as dishonesty, because the context matters. The wages of Victorian domestic servants were, by any contemporary standard, extremely modest. A general servant in a small household might receive £7 or £8 a year in the mid-Victorian period. A cook in a more substantial household might receive between £15 and £25, which was considered a skilled professional wage. Even accounting for the provision of board and lodging, these were small sums, small enough that the loss of even minor informal compensations would have made a meaningful difference to the servant's material situation. The secondary economy of the Victorian servant was, in large part, a rational response to formal wages that did not fully compensate for the labor provided, and the employers who benefited from that labor, and who benefited from the secondary economies they chose not to see, were in their selective blindness complicit in the arrangement. And as the night deepens around the old house, let us move from the economic to the more personal. Because there is another kind of secret that the servants kept, and it is perhaps the most human kind. They had friendships. They had, in the most natural human way, affections and alliances and coalitions and rivalries and crushes and occasionally, discreetly, romances. They had favorite colleagues and disliked colleagues. They had preferences, opinions, enthusiasms. They had in their off hours, which were rare and limited, but which existed, their own private social world. The servants' hall in the larger Victorian house was not simply a dining room. It was, in the hours when work permitted, a social space. A space where the hierarchy relaxed slightly, never entirely, but somewhat, where conversation happened and jokes were made and news was passed around, where someone who could play the piano or the fiddle might do so on an occasional evening, where the younger servants received from the older ones the informal education that the formal training could not provide. In the evenings, in the brief windows of time between the clearing of the family's dinner and the beginning of the next day's preparation, there might be sewing. Servants mended and made their own clothing in these hours. They made small gifts for each other. They wrote letters to family if they had family elsewhere by the light of a single candle. And they talked. They talked about the family. Of course they talked about the family. How could they not? The family was the entire context of their working lives. They knew things about the family that the family did not know they knew. They had observations, interpretations, theories, judgments. They shared these carefully in the servants' hall. They talked about the household, about the work, the standards, the management, about whether the new cook was better or worse than the previous one, about whether the housekeeper was fair. about whether the master was the kind of man who noticed their work and appreciated it, or the kind who noticed only when something went wrong. They talked about the future, about the possibility of marriage. Marriage was the primary exit route from domestic service for women, and in the servants' hall, the subject of courtship and prospects and the relative merits of various potential partners was a perennial topic. They talked about saving money, about references, about moving to a better position. And sometimes, particularly among the closer friendships, the relationships that developed between two women who shared an attic room and a candle stub and a half-day off together once a week. They talked about what they thought and felt about the life they were living. These conversations, by their nature, were almost never recorded. The occasional diary that has survived, the occasional letter. A memoir written late in life, looking back on service years with the particular clear-eyed distance that old age sometimes provides. But most of it is simply gone. What we know is that the friendships were real and were valued. That women who had been in service together maintained contact for decades after they had left the same household. That the shared experience of the servants' hall, the shared knowledge, the shared labor, the shared management of the space between the formal expectations and the private life created bonds that were genuine and lasting. The house, in the end, was not just the employer's house. It was also, in a complicated and circumscribed and never quite acknowledged way, theirs. The afternoon dust, drawing ROOMS, and the art of not being seen the afternoon in a Victorian household had a particular quality that is different from both the morning and the evening. The morning was busy in a purposeful way, directed, sequential, urgent in its own quiet manner. The evening was busy in a different way, the dining room, the dinner service, the careful management of the family's social life. But the afternoon had a slower, more diffuse quality. It was the time when certain long preparations were made, when certain regular maintenance tasks were accomplished, when the servants had their brief window of something slightly less pressured than the norm. It was also, in many households, the time for the cleaning of the drawing room. The drawing room was, in the Victorian house, the room of highest social importance. It was the room where guests were received, where ladies retired after dinner, where the family spent its private social hours. Its contents, the furniture, the ornaments, the pictures on the walls, the various objects that accumulated on the mantelpiece and the side tables and the whatnot shelves, represented the household's social identity. The drawing room of a Victorian family told you, with considerable precision, what kind of people they were, what they valued, how they saw themselves in relation to the world. Maintaining it was, accordingly, a task of some delicacy. The dusting of the drawing room was not like the dusting of a servant's attic bedroom, where a few firm strokes of a cloth would suffice. The drawing room contained objects that required individual attention: the porcelain figurines on the mantelpiece, the collection of papier-mâché boxes on the side table, the framed photographs on the piano lid, the glass-domed ornaments that sat on various elevated surfaces throughout the room. Each of these objects had to be moved, dusted carefully, and returned to its precise original position. That last detail is worth emphasizing: the precise original position. Victorian drawing rooms were arranged with considerable intentionality. The positions of objects on the mantelpiece, of small tables in relation to chairs, of framed photographs in relation to each other, these were not casual. They were considered. Sometimes they were the result of the mistress's deliberate aesthetic choices. Sometimes they reflected a deeper sentimental logic. This photograph must be to the left of that one. because of the particular emotional significance of their relationship. Sometimes the arrangement was simply the accumulated result of years of gradual settling into place like sediment, so that it felt completely fixed and natural, even though no one could quite have articulated why. If an object was returned to the wrong position after dusting, it would be noticed, not necessarily immediately. Perhaps not that day, but eventually, and possibly at a moment that made the displacement particularly visible, like when a visitor remarked on something, or when the mistress sat down to write a letter, and found that the small china inkwell she always placed at a particular angle on the writing table was not at that angle. The displacement would register, and it would matter. The housemaid, therefore, learned to pay attention to these arrangements in the same way she learned the geography of the dark staircase. Through observation, through care, through the development of a visual memory for the particular organization of each room in her care. Some housemaids became extraordinarily skilled at this. There are accounts of housemaids who could restore a complicated arrangement of mantelpiece objects to its exact previous configuration after cleaning, and who could detect, from the slight displacement of a cushion or the angle of a picture frame, that something had been touched or moved in the night, by a cat, perhaps, or by a sleepwalking family member, or by a visiting child who had been told not to touch things. This was another variety of the invisible knowledge that we keep returning to. The knowledge that accumulated in the body and the eye through continuous careful practice, that never appeared in any employment advertisement or household manual, that was simply part of what a good housemaid was and did. The fireplace in the drawing room required its own particular attentions. I have already described the basic process of cleaning and relaying fires in the early morning. But the drawing room fireplace, particularly in a household where the mistress had strong opinions about its appearance and management, involved additional considerations. The surround, the decorative facing of the fireplace, which might be in marble, or painted cast iron, or carved stone, or tile, depending on the period and style of the house, required cleaning of its own. Marble needed to be washed with a specific preparation and polished. Cast iron needed its own treatment, different from the plain blacking used on the kitchen range. It might be polished with a graphite paste that produced a particular metallic sheen rather than the flat black of the utility finish. Tiles needed careful wiping to preserve their glazed surface without streaking. The hearth rug, typically a special rug placed before the fireplace to catch sparks and protect the carpet, needed to be shaken out and, if necessary, beaten. The fire irons, the tongs, the poker, the shovel, the fire screen needed to be polished and returned to their proper arrangement beside the hearth. The fender, the low decorative barrier that ran across the front of the hearth, was typically in polished steel or brass, and maintaining its gleam was an ongoing project. Steel fenders needed regular polishing with emery cloth or a steel polishing paste. Brass needed its own specific treatment, a paste made from vinegar and salt and flour, or a commercial brass polish, applied and then buffed to produce the warm golden gleam that was the desired effect. The fire itself, once laid and lit, needed to be managed through the afternoon and evening. Kept burning, kept at a reasonable level, not allowed to die down below the point of comfort nor to burn too fiercely and produce a room full of dry, overheated air. The coal scuttle beside the fire needed to be kept filled. These tasks fell to the housemaid or the footman, whoever was assigned to the room. And through all of this, the polishing, the managing, the quiet maintenance, the servant working in the drawing room was also listening for sounds from the corridor, and watching the door and being prepared at any moment to become invisible, because the family might come in at any time. And if they came in while the housemaid was on her knees polishing the fender, the correct response was to stand, step back, and wait with eyes down until she was acknowledged or until the family had settled and she could quietly withdraw. The family's space was never quite the servant's space, even when the servant was the only person in it. There is something I want to tell you about the windows, because in the Victorian house, the windows were not simply windows. They were, in the formal rooms at least, treated objects with their own maintenance requirements, their own seasonal considerations, their own place in the annual and weekly rhythm of household work. The curtains first. The curtains in a Victorian drawing room were typically heavy layers of them in some houses, an inner layer of fine silk or muslin or lace, an outer layer of heavier fabric, velvet, brocade, damask. In some houses, a third layer of practical cotton rep between the two to protect the expensive outer curtains from the light. The curtains hung on rails of various designs, some wooden, some brass. They swept the floor in the fashionable mode or hung just above it. These curtains collected dust. They collected the soot from the gas lamps. They collected, in the city, the fine particulate pollution that was the permanent condition of the Victorian urban atmosphere, particularly in London, where the combination of coal fires from millions of houses, factory smoke, fog, and river mist produced a particular quality of air that was effective at penetrating even closed windows and depositing its residue on fabric surfaces. The curtains were not washed weekly, like the household linen. Washing would shrink or damage many of the fabrics involved. They were regularly shaken, taken down from their rails periodically, carried outside if the weather permitted, shaken vigorously to dislodge the accumulated dust, then rehung. They were occasionally brushed with a soft, long-handled brush, working gently along the pile of the velvet or the grain of the brocade. In some houses, they were sent to a professional cleaner once or twice a year, an early form of dry cleaning. The windows themselves needed to be cleaned, polished to a streak-free clarity that was one of the markers of a well-maintained house. Dirty windows, particularly those visible from the street, were a social commentary. They said something about the household. A house with clean windows and a whitened front step was a house that took its standards seriously. A house with dirty windows was, well, it was a house with dirty windows, and people would draw their own conclusions. The method for Victorian window cleaning was characteristically specific and somewhat elaborate. The glass was first washed with warm water in which a small amount of vinegar had been added. The slight acidity of the vinegar helped cut through the greasy residue that accumulated on glass surfaces from coal smoke and cooking vapors. A leather chamois, wrung almost dry, was used for the main washing. Then the glass was polished dry with a clean, soft cloth using a circular motion. Finally, if the glass was still slightly streaky, which it often was, particularly in cold weather when the temperature difference between inside and outside caused condensation, it was polished again with a piece of crumpled newspaper, whose slightly abrasive texture and slight ink content helped produce a final clarity. This last technique, the newspaper polish, is one of those things that has actually persisted quite remarkably into the present day. People still use crumpled newspaper for streak-free glass cleaning, often without knowing why it works or where the practice came from. It comes from here, from the Victorian housemaid, on her knees in the drawing room in the gray winter afternoon, working her way along the tall windows with methodical care. The water carrying an hour in the life of the body in service. I want to slow down even further and spend some time with a single, specific activity. Not because it is the most dramatic or the most historically significant, but because it is one of those activities that illuminates, in very clear light, the physical reality of life in service in a way that more dramatic events sometimes do not. The activity is the carrying of hot water. In the Victorian house, before the widespread installation of bathroom plumbing with hot water supply, which was not a universal feature even by the end of the 19th century, hot water for personal washing was carried to wherever it was needed by the housemaid. This happened at specific times of day as part of the household's daily routine. In the morning, before the family got up, large quantities of hot water were needed. Each occupied bedroom had a washstand, a piece of furniture specifically designed for the purpose, with a basin and ewer, a soap dish, a small shelf for toiletry items, and usually a lower shelf for the matching chamber pot or slop pail. The washstand was meant to be furnished every morning with hot water in the ewer so that the occupant could wash on rising. This sounds simple. The water had to be heated in the kitchen. Then it had to be transferred to large copper hot water cans, typically with a fixed lid that prevented too much sloshing, and a long handle for carrying, and carried up the stairs. In a moderate-sized house, this might mean carrying 3 or 4 cans of water up to the first floor. In a large house with multiple occupied bedrooms and possibly a second floor of guest rooms as well, this might mean 8, 10, 12 cans. Each can, when full, was heavy. Boiling water is heavy, more to the point. Boiling water in a can that you are carrying is dangerous, since a stumble on the stairs or a poorly judged grip could result in serious scalding. The housemaid learned to walk on stairs with heavy hot water cans with a particular careful gait. She learned the temperature of the can's handle at different stages, extremely hot from the kitchen, slightly less hot by the time she reached the first floor landing, manageable but still warm as she moved between rooms. She learned the particular physics of the full can, the sloshing of the water, the way the handle distributed the weight, the specific micro-adjustments needed to keep the water from surging over the edge if she had to turn suddenly. She might make this walk 5 or 6 times in a morning before breakfast, twice from the kitchen to the first floor, then back, then up again. Her arms, by the time the morning's water was distributed, had received a workout that was not trivial. And then after the morning water, the slop work. The slop pails, the containers that received the used washwater, the contents of the chamber pots, the various liquid domestic residues, had to be emptied. They were collected from the bedrooms, carried downstairs, emptied into the appropriate drains or disposal points, washed and returned. The handling of slop pails and chamber pots was perhaps the most universally disliked aspect of housemaid work, and it was performed with a pragmatic professionalism that speaks well of the people who had to do it. The chamber pot in a household without connected bathroom plumbing was an essential piece of domestic equipment. The master of the house used one, the mistress used one, the children used them, the guests used them. They were emptied and cleaned every morning, without fail, without comment, without any acknowledgement from the people who had used them, or from the society that required this service, that the task was being done at all. This is perhaps the most radical example of the invisible service we have been discussing all evening, because there is no more intimate evidence of human physical existence than this, and it was invisible. It was performed, it was managed, it was made to disappear, and the family proceeded through their days in the comfortable assumption that this aspect of physical life, like all the others, was simply taken care of. Let me shift slightly from the practical to the physical, from what was done to the experience of doing it. The Victorian domestic servant's body was, in a quite real sense, a working body. A body organized by its work, shaped by its work, marked by its work. The hands of a housemaid or a laundry maid were recognizable in the Victorian period as such. The constant exposure to hot water and lye soap, and the dry air of heated rooms and the cold air of stone passages produced hands that were chapped and roughened, with particular patterns of wear and callus that differed from the smooth hands of a lady or the calloused, differently hands of an outdoor worker. A lady's maid whose work required particular gentleness with fine fabrics and personal grooming might take considerable care of her hands, pumice, cream, the avoidance of unnecessary roughening. The laundry maid had fewer such opportunities. The back and knees of a housemaid who spent a significant portion of her day kneeling, at fireplaces, at low surfaces, at the scrubbing of floors, developed the particular where patterns associated with that posture. Housemaid's knee, technically bursitis, the inflammation of the small fluid sacs that cushion the kneecap, was common enough to have its own specific name in the Victorian medical literature. It was listed as an occupational condition, alongside the various industrial ailments, because it was that prevalent. The back, the arms, the feet, the whole body of the servant bore the marks of its occupation. Servants were typically required to stand in the presence of the family, except under specific circumstances. They stood for long periods, often on stone or tile floors. They walked many miles each day within the confines of the house, between the kitchen and the dining room, between the laundry and the upper floors, between the servants' hall and all the various points their work required them to visit. There were, of course, no formal health and safety considerations for domestic servants. There were no regulations. There was no inspection. The servant's physical welfare was entirely at the discretion of the employer, and while many employers were genuinely concerned about their servants' health, others were not, and there was no external mechanism to enforce any standard. This is a plain and simple historical fact. And I mention it not to introduce a note of inappropriate drama into what has been, and will continue to be, a quiet and unhurried evening, but because ignoring it would be a kind of dishonesty. The work was real. The bodies that did it were real. The physical cost was real. And the people who bore that cost continued, day after day, to perform it with a professionalism and a skill, and a degree of quiet pride that the record, where it survives, consistently reveals. Evening, the dining room and its ceremonial world. Let us move now into the evening. Because the evening in the Victorian household was the performance for which everything else was, in a certain sense, the preparation. Dinner, the main meal of the day, served in the evening in the households of the middle and upper classes, was the moment when the Victorian household displayed itself at its fullest. The dining room, the table, the silver, the china, the food, the service, all of it contributed to a performance of domestic and social excellence that was one of the primary ways the household communicated its status and its values. And behind this performance was an enormous amount of preparation, invisible preparation, that had been going on since the early morning. Let us start with the laying of the table. The Victorian dinner table, in a household of any standing, was laid according to a precise protocol. The positions of the various pieces of the place setting, the main plate position, the side plates, the arrangement of forks to the left and knives and spoons to the right, the glasses for the various wines that would be served, the napkin folded in its particular style, the salt cellars placed at the correct intervals, the finger bowls and their arrangements. These followed rules that were codified in multiple household manuals and that were understood by anyone who had been properly trained in table service. The exact nature of the rules varied somewhat by period and by the formality of the household. The Victorian era saw considerable evolution in table-setting conventions, as the formal service à la Française, in which all the dishes of a course were placed on the table simultaneously, in a somewhat symmetrical arrangement, gradually gave way to service à la Russe, in which dishes were brought in sequence and served individually, which required a rather different table arrangement and a rather different approach to service. But regardless of the precise conventions being followed, the laying of the table required skill, attention to detail, and a significant investment of time. The tablecloth first. A large dinner table with a large tablecloth in heavy damask was not a trivially simple thing to arrange. The cloth had to fall evenly on both sides. It had to be perfectly smooth without creases, which meant that it had to have been properly ironed and carefully stored without pressure that might reintroduce creasing. It had to be centered precisely on the table. Getting all of this right with a cloth that might be 12 feet long and 5 feet wide was a two-person job, done with the kind of mutual understanding and practiced coordination that develops between servants who have worked together for some time. Then the plate positions. The silver, we have talked about the silver and its polished perfection. Each piece placed precisely in its position relative to the others, at the exact prescribed distances. The glasses, crystal or cut glass, polished to a brilliance that would catch the candlelight, and the candlelight. The candles deserved a chapter of their own, though we will give them only a few paragraphs here. The Victorian dinner table was lit primarily by candles, in candelabras, in individual candlesticks, sometimes supplemented by the light of the gas lamps on the walls, but with the candles providing the primary intimate illumination of the table itself. The candlelight was not incidental. It was deliberate. It produced the particular quality of warmth and intimacy and movement that the dinner table was supposed to have, and that electric light, when it eventually arrived, was widely felt to be unable to fully replicate. The candles had to be the right height, which meant they had to be the right size and type for the particular candelabras being used. They had to be straight. A candle that tilted, even slightly, in its holder looked sloppy. They had to be matched in height across the table so that the light was even, and they had to be fresh. A dinner table set with the partially burned stubs of the previous evening's candles was not acceptable. The footman, or the butler in the most formal households, lit the candles immediately before the family and their guests came down to dinner. Not too early, or they would burn down too far during the meal. Not too late, or the room would not be fully lit. The timing was another element of the practiced orchestration. The service of dinner was, in the Victorian household, a performance in the most theatrical sense, and the servants who performed it were, in a particular sense, actors in a play they had rehearsed so many times that they could perform it without thought. The footman, or the parlor maid, circled the table with the serving dishes. The convention was to approach from the left, to present the dish at the correct angle, to hold it steady while the diner served himself or herself, to withdraw without hurry or awkward haste, to anticipate the needs of each diner, to see, without being told, that a glass needed refilling, that a piece of bread had been taken and another would soon be wanted, that a particular guest was ready to receive the next course while another was still finishing. The butler supervised all of this from his position at the sideboard, where the wines were kept, and from which the glasses were filled. He watched the table with the particular attention of a conductor watching an orchestra, aware of the overall performance, aware of the parts, ready to make small adjustments and corrections with a look or a gesture. The ideal dinner service was invisible in the same way that all the other service we have been discussing was invisible. The dishes appeared. The glasses were full. The crumbs were removed. There was a specific tool, the crumb brush and tray, used for this purpose, swept across the table between courses with a particular practiced motion that removed the evidence of the previous course without any dramatic gesture or noise. The empty plates disappeared. The next course arrived. The family ate and talked. There were, of course, things that could go wrong. The practiced surface of the Victorian dinner service, the smoothness, the silence, the professional discretion was maintained at some effort, and it was maintained precisely because the alternative was conspicuous and uncomfortable. A dropped fork was a small disaster in the logic of the Victorian dining room. Not truly disastrous, the world would not end, and the diner whose fork it was would simply be provided with a fresh one from the sideboard. But it drew attention. It broke the surface. It made something visible that was supposed to be invisible. The fact that the service was performed by human beings who were capable of error, who had physical existence, who were tired sometimes and cold sometimes and unhappy sometimes. The experienced footman or parlor maid who dropped a fork did not flinch, did not exclaim, smoothly retrieved the fork, smoothly produced a replacement, moved on. The reaction itself, the smoothness of the recovery, was part of the performance. But in the servants' hall later, after the family had gone through to the drawing room and the dining room was being cleared, the dropped fork would be mentioned. Quietly, without drama. A brief acknowledgement that it had happened, that it was noted, that the standard had briefly not been met, and the evening would continue. In the accounts of dinner service written by former servants, there is a recurring quality of professional attention that strikes me every time I read them. Not the kind of attention that is anxious or deferential or strained. The kind of attention that belongs to someone who has thoroughly mastered a complex set of skills and who applies them with a quiet confidence. There is pride in these accounts, a craftsman's pride again, the pride of work done well in difficult circumstances to a high standard. That pride is real, and it deserves to be recognized. The night ends and begins again. The dinner is over. The family has gone through to the drawing room or the library or wherever the evening's entertainment is to take place. The dining room is being cleared. The footman removes the remains of the dishes. The butler accounts for the wine that has been consumed and returns the remainder to the cellar. The table is cleared entirely, the tablecloth removed, the candlesticks extinguished. And downstairs in the kitchen, a second wave of work begins. Because everything that was used in the preparation of the dinner needs to be cleaned. The pots, the pans, the roasting tins, the serving dishes, the ladles, the strainers, the various implements of the cook's art that have accumulated through the day's work. These fall to the scullery maid, who is perhaps the lowest in the kitchen hierarchy, and whose work is in some respects the hardest. The scullery maid's evening was long. She washed dishes in hot water that she had carried from the copper, because the scullery often did not have hot water on tap. She washed pots and pans in water made deliberately harsher, with more soda or more lye, to cut through the residues of cooking. She scoured the roasting tins with sand or ash to remove the burned-on deposits. She cleaned the fish kettle and the stock pot and the preserving pan if it had been used. She finished, typically, well after the upper household had settled for the night. She might not be done until 11 or 11:30 in the evening. after starting work at 6 in the morning. 17 hours at the low end of a busy day, with a break of perhaps an hour in the middle of the afternoon and perhaps 30 minutes in the morning. And in the morning at 6 or 5:30 in some houses, she would get up and begin again. Before the house is entirely dark, let us visit one more room, the housekeeper's room. It is late. The housekeeper, let us imagine her as a woman in her early 50s, a woman who has been in service for 30 years and who has managed this particular household for the past 12, is sitting at her small desk. The lamp on the desk is low. On the desk in front of her is the household book, the record of accounts, of weekly expenditures, of stocks and provisions and wages. She is making the final entries for the day. This is a nightly ritual. The household accounts were maintained daily in the larger establishments, and the housekeeper's bookkeeping was both a practical necessity and a matter of professional pride. Every penny of expenditure had to be accounted for. Every item purchased had to be recorded. At the end of the week, the accounts were presented to the mistress of the house for review. The housekeeper was financially responsible for what she spent. If her accounts were consistently over budget, she would hear about it. If she showed evidence of waste or mismanagement, her position was at risk. If her accounts were consistently under budget, within reason, she had demonstrated a professional competence that contributed to her standing. But the accounts were more than a financial record. They were also a management document. The housekeeper tracked the consumption of stores, how quickly the coal was going through, which suggested whether the fires were being managed efficiently, how much flour and sugar and butter had been used, which gave her information about the cook's use of materials, how many candles had been consumed, which told her something about the hours and habits of the household. All of this information, assembled day by day, gave the housekeeper a picture of the household's functioning that was as detailed and as specific as any business manager's report. She set down her pen, closed the household book. The lamp was extinguished. The house was dark, almost, because somewhere in the attic, a housemaid who was awake despite the late hour was writing a letter by the light of a single candle stub. To her mother, perhaps, or to a friend from a previous position. The letter describes, in the careful handwriting of someone who was taught to write at a Sunday school and who has practiced it with no other opportunity, the small details of her current position, the other servants, the family, the particular quirks of the house. The letter was sent eventually. Whether it was kept, whether it survived, I cannot tell you. Almost certainly it did not. The house was dark. The work would begin again in 5 hours. Special occasions, the annual cleaning and the turning of the house. A new section begins here. The pace remains very slow, but there is a gentle shift in focus, as though a different hour has arrived. And as the night deepens around us, let us think about something different. Let us move from the daily to the seasonal, from the rhythm of the single day to the larger rhythm of the year, because the Victorian household had annual and seasonal rhythms as well as daily ones. And the annual cleaning, the great turning out of the house that was undertaken periodically and most typically in the spring, was one of the largest and most comprehensive operations of the domestic year. The spring clean, you may recognize the term. The practice of the spring clean, of a particularly thorough, particularly comprehensive, particularly disruptive household cleaning at the end of winter, has persisted into our own time in attenuated form. Most people have a general sense of what a spring clean involves: washing windows, turning out cupboards, cleaning behind the furniture. In the Victorian household, the spring clean was considerably more than this. It was, essentially, the disassembly and reassembly of the entire house. Let us describe what this meant. First, the house was disrupted to a degree that would have been unthinkable in the ordinary course of operation. Furniture was moved out of rooms entirely, into corridors, into other rooms, sometimes temporarily into the garden if the weather permitted. Carpets were rolled up and taken outside to be beaten, hung on the carpet poles in the yard and beaten with the carpet beater, a flat paddle-like implement whose use produced remarkable quantities of dust and required significant physical effort. The dust that emerged from a winter's worth of carpet use, when beaten out into the air of the yard, was considerable. The walls of the rooms, the wallpaper, if there was wallpaper, or the painted plaster were cleaned. This was done with a piece of stale bread in some techniques. The slightly dry, slightly rough surface of stale bread was found to be effective at removing the surface grime from wallpaper without wetting it, which would have damaged it. Fresh white bread was sometimes used in a similar way. The effectiveness of this technique, which sounds deeply impractical, is actually based on the absorbent and slightly abrasive properties of the bread's outer surface, and it worked reasonably well on the right type of wallpaper. The ceilings were swept with a long-handled broom fitted with a soft brush, or with a feather duster attached to a very long pole to clear the cobwebs and the accumulated dust from the upper surfaces of the room. This was awkward, ladder-requiring work, and the dust that was dislodged inevitably fell, creating an atmosphere in the room that was temporarily rather unpleasant to breathe. The woodwork, the skirting boards, the door frames, the window frames, the chair rails was washed down, in most cases with a solution of warm water and white soap, and then possibly refinished with a small amount of oil or varnish to restore its surface. The fixtures, the gas brackets, the picture rails, the hooks and handles and knobs of various kinds were cleaned individually. The pictures on the walls were taken down, their frames dusted and polished, their glass cleaned, and they were returned to their positions. The mirrors were cleaned. The window panes were cleaned, inside and out. And then when the room was fully cleaned in this comprehensive way, everything went back. The furniture moved back into the room and arranged precisely as it had been. The carpet brought back in from the yard and relaid. The ornaments, the pictures, the cushions, the curtains. Each room in the house went through this process, one at a time in sequence, so that the disruption was managed and the household could continue to function, imperfectly, awkwardly, with rooms temporarily unavailable and furniture temporarily displaced through the process. The whole thing might take 2 or 3 weeks. There was a specific practice associated with the spring clean that I find particularly interesting, and that gives us a small window into the material culture of the Victorian household in a way that the daily routines do not quite provide. This was the airing of the stored fabrics. Victorian households of any size accumulated significant quantities of stored fabrics. Not just the household linen that was in regular use, but the reserve linen, the tablecloths and sheets and napkins that were kept in store against the needs of larger gatherings, or as replacements when the regular items wore out. And beyond the linen, the stored fabrics included the curtains for the winter rooms that were changed to lighter summer curtains in spring, and the heavy winter covers that were put on certain chairs and sofas to protect them in the season when they were used more heavily, and the various decorative cloths and runners and covers that were used only occasionally. All of these stored fabrics had a particular enemy: moths. The moth larvae, the specific variety that damaged fabric, was the clothes moth, Tinola basileella, whose caterpillars could cause significant damage to stored woolen and other natural fibers if left unchecked, were a constant concern in Victorian households. The spring clean was, in part, a comprehensive moth inspection and prevention operation. Every piece of stored fabric was taken out of its storage, shaken, examined carefully for the telltale holes or the small papery cases that indicated larval presence, aired in sunlight, which the moth larvae found unwelcoming, folded differently so that any larvae that might be living in the folds were dislodged and disrupted, and then they were stored again with the various preventive measures that Victorian housekeepers employed. Dried lavender in small cloth bags was the most pleasant smelling of these. The lavender was held to repel the moth, though the mechanism was not fully understood. Camphor balls, small white spheres of camphor, a pungent organic compound extracted from camphor trees, were more aggressively effective. Cedar wood shavings in sachets, dried rue or dried wormwood, various commercial preparations as the century progressed. The stored linen closets of a well-managed Victorian household had a characteristic smell, a mixture of lavender and camphor and cedar, and the particular clean smell of thoroughly washed and starched fabric. That was entirely distinct, and that I have seen described in several memoirs as one of the most powerfully evocative sensory memories of childhood, for people who grew up in households where the linen closets were properly maintained. Smell is, as we know, the most powerful activator of memory. The smell of lavender and camphor from a linen closet carries, for the person who knew it in childhood, everything that that house contained. Every morning, every meal, every long afternoon, every winter evening. The entirety of the past folded into a simple sensory signal. The housemaid who packed that lavender into the sachets, who organized the linen, who maintained the closets, she did not necessarily know that she was creating these memories. She was simply doing her work, but the memory, if it persists, is partly hers. The body of the house, pipes, drains, and the hidden SYSTMS, there is a level of the Victorian house that we have not yet visited, and it is the lowest level, the foundation level. The level of pipes and drains and the hidden systems that made the upper house possible. I want to talk about this level briefly, because it represents a dimension of Victorian domestic life that is almost entirely invisible in the conventional accounts, and yet that was the source of one of the most persistent and serious practical challenges of Victorian household management. This is the drainage. The drainage of a Victorian house was, in many cases, imperfect. Depending on the age of the house, its location, the date of its last significant renovation, and the state of local public infrastructure, the drainage might range from adequate to genuinely problematic. The mid-Victorian period was one of significant public health reform in Britain, the work of Edwin Chadwick and then John Simon in public health, the construction of London's Great Sewage System by Joseph Bazalgette from the 1860s onward, the gradual improvement of water supply and sanitation in the major cities. But reform came unevenly and slowly, and many households, particularly the older and more rural ones, lived with drainage arrangements that were considerably less than ideal for much of the century. The drains of a Victorian house required monitoring, not necessarily by the servants themselves. The actual repair of drains was the work of a plumber, and the Victorian plumber, though considerably less skilled than his modern counterpart in many respects, was a recognized tradesperson who did proper work. But the monitoring, the detection of problems, the maintenance of the drain's functional state, this fell to the household staff. The principal concern was smell, before the proper understanding of germ theory, which became practical public health knowledge from the 1880s onward. The dominant theory of disease transmission was miasma theory, the idea that disease arose from and was transmitted by bad air, particularly air with a foul smell. This theory was wrong in its mechanism, but not entirely wrong in its implications. Many of the conditions that produced bad smells, particularly rotting organic matter and stagnant water in drains, were indeed correlated with disease transmission, even if the mechanism was bacterial rather than miasmatic. The household's practical response to this concern was a constant vigilance against bad smells. The drains were inspected regularly. The drain traps, the U-bends or S-bends that were supposed to maintain a water seal preventing sewer gas from entering the house, were checked. The pipes under the sinks were examined for blockages or leaks. The outside drains were kept clear. If any drain developed a smell, it was treated as a matter of urgency, and a combination of lime water, disinfectant preparations, and the plumber were brought to bear on it with some promptness. This vigilance against drain smells was such a consistent feature of the Victorian household that it comes up repeatedly in household management manuals, in health literature, and in the personal accounts of housekeepers. It was part of the routine monitoring of the house's condition, as much as the checking of windows and doors or the monitoring of the coal supply. And it was largely invisible work, in the sense that the detection of a problem and the marshalling of a response happened in the background, below the level of the family's awareness, managed by the housekeeper or the cook or the head housemaid, brought to the family's attention only if the problem was severe enough to require significant disruption or expense. The smell did not reach the drawing room. That was the result. The cellars. Every house of any size had cellars, and the Victorian household cellars were active spaces, in use daily, serving multiple functions. There was the wine cellar, which was the butler's domain. Cool, dark, constant in temperature, the basement provided the natural temperature stability that wine storage required before the era of mechanical refrigeration. The wines were stored in their bins, organized by type and vintage, cataloged in the butler's cellar book. The ordering of wine, the managing of stocks, the decanting of bottles that needed it, all of this was the butler's responsibility, and he took it seriously. There was the coal cellar, or sometimes multiple coal cellars, where the household's coal supply was stored. Coal was delivered by the coal merchant in large quantities, a ton or more at a time, and the delivery itself was a significant event, involving considerable noise and disruption, as the coal was shot down through the pavement-level coal holes into the cellar below. The coal cellar had to be organized so that the coal could be easily shoveled and carried as needed. The coal dust that accumulated in and around the cellar was one of the more persistent sources of mess in the Victorian house. There was typically a larder or cool storage room at cellar level for perishable food items, particularly in houses that had not yet acquired an ice chest or ice house. The cool, constant temperature of the basement made it the natural storage point for items that needed to be kept cold, and the management of this storage, knowing what was there, in what condition, in what order it should be used, was part of the cook's or the housekeeper's daily operations. And in some houses there were other cellar rooms, for general storage, for the storage of surplus furniture, for the keeping of the household's various accumulations of things that were neither currently used nor quite ready to be discarded. The cellar was its own world, darker, quieter, cooler than the rest of the house. The servants who worked in it regularly developed the particular confidence in that environment that we have already noted in other dark and enclosed spaces. They knew their way around it in near darkness. They knew where the floor was uneven, where the ceiling was low, where the shelves were placed. The butler, particularly, had an almost proprietary relationship with the wine cellar. It was his space. He knew every bottle in it. He knew the condition of the cellar, whether it was too damp, whether the temperature had fluctuated, whether the cellar was properly aired. He monitored it with the attention of a guardian. And sometimes, when the household was settled and the evening's work was done, the butler would be found in the cellar by himself, in the lamplight, checking the bottles in their racks with the slow, methodical care of someone doing a thing they know how to do and take quiet satisfaction in doing well. The lady's maid, the most intimate service. There is one figure in the Victorian household whom we have mentioned but not yet properly visited, and that is the lady's maid. She deserves her own chapter because her work was different in kind, as well as in degree, from the work of the other servants. Because her relationship to the mistress of the house was different, more personal, more intimate, more complicated than the relationships that governed most of the other service positions. Because the lady's maid occupied a unique social space that was, in some ways, the most interesting and most psychologically complex space in the entire household. Let us begin with what she did. The lady's maid's primary responsibility was the personal care of the mistress. She helped the mistress dress in the morning and undress in the evening. She maintained the mistress's wardrobe, cleaning it, repairing it, pressing it, organizing it. She dressed the mistress's hair, a skill that required specific training and practice, since the elaborate coiffures of the Victorian period were not simple or quick to produce. She attended to the mistress's personal grooming, nail care, skin care, the various preparations and potions that formed part of a Victorian lady's beauty routine. She accompanied the mistress when she traveled. She was present at the beginning and the end of each day. The intimacy of this position was real. The lady's maid knew things about the mistress that the mistress's husband did not know. She knew her body, its imperfections, its changes, its particular characteristics. She knew her moods, could read, from the set of her shoulders as she sat before the dressing glass, whether she was troubled or content. She knew her secrets, not necessarily because she had been told them, but because intimate attendance over years inevitably produces knowledge. And the lady's maid was required, absolutely, to maintain a complete and perfect discretion about everything she knew. This discretion was not merely professional, it was essential. The lady's maid who talked, who shared what she knew with other servants, or who allowed anything she had observed or overheard to reach the wider world, was finished. Not just in this household, but in all possibility of future employment. Discretion was the foundational requirement of the position, and it was non-negotiable. The skills the lady's maid brought to her work were considerable and specific. Hairdressing, as I have mentioned, was the most conspicuous of these. The hairstyles of the Victorian period changed continuously, as all fashions do, and the lady's maid had to keep up with these changes. She had to know how to dress hair in the current style, which might involve elaborate coiling and pinning, the use of false hairpieces or pads to create volume, the application of pomades or oils to produce the desired surface quality, and the use of heated irons to produce curl or wave. The heated irons for hair, curling irons, crimping irons, various other implements, were kept hot by being held in the flame of a spirit lamp or laid on the back of the kitchen range. The use of them required both skill and nerve, because the margin between a well-formed curl and a singed lock of hair was not wide, and the correct temperature was judged by touch and experience rather than by any instrument. The lady's maid learned these skills partly from training. There were books, there were experienced colleagues who could teach, and partly from practice. She practiced, in many cases, on herself. A lady's maid who could not demonstrate competence with hair by the look of her own was not going to inspire confidence in her employer. Beyond hair, the lady's maid's skills included fine sewing and the alteration of garments. She was expected to be able to maintain the mistress's wardrobe at a high standard, which meant repairing fine lace, replacing small buttons or hooks, letting out or taking in seams as the mistress's figure changed over time, and sometimes adapting older garments to current fashions. The renovation and adaptation of existing clothes was an important function, since even wealthy women did not replace their entire wardrobes every season, and a skilled lady's maid could extend the life of expensive garments considerably through careful maintenance and clever alteration. She also handled the cleaning and care of the more delicate items in the wardrobe. Fine silk dresses that could not be laundered required spot cleaning and refreshing with various preparations. Velvet, which crushed easily and from which creases were difficult to remove, needed specific handling, usually steaming, held over a vessel of hot water to raise the pile. Embroidered items needed careful treatment to avoid damaging the embroidery while cleaning the ground fabric. The mistress's jewelry in most households was in the lady's maid's care. She kept it organized, cleaned it, and was responsible for its security when not in use. This was a significant responsibility, and the trust it implied was real. The relationship between the lady's maid and the mistress was one of the most complex in the Victorian domestic world. It was not a friendship in any simple sense. The social gap was real, and neither party was expected to forget it. The lady's maid did not presume on the intimacy that her work created. She did not initiate personal conversation. She did not offer opinions on matters that were not within her professional purview, but it was also not a purely formal employment relationship. How could it be? When someone is present at your most private moments, when they know the most personal details of your physical existence, when you have spoken to them, in the early morning hours when you are not quite yet fully in your public self, with a directness that you would not use in more formal contexts, something has passed between you that is not nothing. Many ladies developed relationships with their ladies' maids that were, while maintaining the formal distinctions of employer and employee, genuinely warm. There are letters and diaries from this period that show women speaking of their ladies' maids with real affection, with real concern for their welfare, with real interest in their lives beyond the boundaries of service. And there are accounts from ladies' maids themselves, rather fewer of these, since ladies' maids were, by the nature of their position, accustomed to keeping their own counsel, that show a similar warmth and a similar careful management of the distinction between warmth and presumption. Some of these relationships lasted for decades. A lady's maid who joined a household as a young woman and who was still with the same mistress when both were old had been witness to an entire life. Marriages, children, bereavements, illnesses, the particular small turning points that constitute the substance of a real life. She had been there for all of it, in the background, maintaining studied indifference, performing her duties with professional care. What she made of what she had seen, what she thought about it, what she felt about it, what meaning, if any, she found in it, is almost entirely unknown to us. She took it with her when she left. the footman's world, appearance, performance, and the male servant. If the lady's maid occupied the most intimate domestic position in the Victorian household, the footman occupied perhaps the most visibly theatrical one. Because the footman was, in the most straightforward sense, a decorative as well as a functional servant, his physical appearance mattered in a way that the other servants' appearances did not in the sense that other servants could be slovenly, but in the specific sense that the footman's height, his bearing, his general physical quality were considered legitimate criteria for his employment and his value. The ideal footman was tall, very tall if possible. 6 feet and above was desirable, and there are employment advertisements from the Victorian period, placed by household registry offices and by employers seeking staff, that specified minimum heights quite directly. 5 feet 10 was sometimes given as a minimum. 6 feet was preferred. Why did height matter for a footman? The answer is partly aesthetic and partly symbolic. The footman's primary visible function, in the dining room, at the door, in attendance at social occasions, placed him in the background of a scene in which the family and their guests were in the foreground. A tall, well-built footman in livery provided a kind of human furniture, a background presence that was imposing without being intrusive, that gave the scene a certain grandeur. A short or slight footman looked, in the language of the time, insufficient. The livery itself was part of this aesthetic. Livery, the formal uniform of the male house servant, was in many households an elaborate costume that varied in detail by household, but that typically involved knee breeches and stockings, rather than trousers, which were practical but less impressive, a tailcoat or dress coat in the household's colors, a waistcoat, formal footwear, and in some households a powdered wig, though this became less universal as the century progressed. The wearing of this livery was itself a kind of performance. The footman in full livery, standing at the door or carrying a dish in the dining room, was not simply a working man in his work clothes. He was a figure in a domestic theater, a visual element in the representation of the household status, and he was aware of this. The footman who performed well at his public duties, who had the right bearing, the right presentation, the right combination of formal dignity and practical efficiency, was valued for these qualities in the same way that he was valued for his practical work. They were not separable. The footman's practical duties were considerable beyond the public performance. In the morning, he cleaned the boots, as we have discussed. He might also clean the knives. The table knives of the Victorian household were steel, not stainless steel, and steel knives required regular cleaning and polishing to maintain their appearance. The knife cleaning machine, a cylindrical device in which knives were inserted and abraded clean by a rotating brush mechanism, was a piece of equipment found in the knife room of larger households, and its operation was typically the footman's responsibility. He maintained the hall, the entrance hall, which was one of the first things a visitor saw on entering the house, and which was therefore a matter of some importance. The hall table, the hall chairs, the hat rack and umbrella stand, the umbrella stand's careful arrangement, the visiting card tray with its protocol of use and management, all of these were in the footman's care. He waited at table, as we have discussed. He answered the front door. He carried messages and parcels. He accompanied the family on outings in an outdoor capacity, riding behind the carriage, attending at functions. He performed the various errands and miscellaneous duties that were assigned to him, and he did all of this while maintaining the physical presentation and bearing that were part of his position. The footman's relationship to his own appearance was, accordingly, rather more consciously managed than that of the other servants. He was accustomed to being looked at in the way that the other servants were not. He was part of the display, and this created a particular quality of self-awareness that runs, in various degrees, through the accounts of footmen that have survived. Some found it congenial, some found it deeply uncomfortable. The discomfort, when expressed, tended to focus on the artificiality of the role, on the sense of being a human prop rather than a person, of being evaluated for attributes, height, looks, bearing, that had nothing to do with any skill or quality one had developed, and of performing an elaborate pantomime of formal dignity whose relationship to any genuine dignity was uncertain. There is a passage in the memoirs of one Victorian former footman, published late in his life, at a period when the old domestic world he had served in had largely disappeared, in which he describes putting on the livery for the first time as a young man. The weight of the coat, the stiffness of the breeches, the powdered wig that was required in that particular household. He describes looking at himself in the mirror in the servants' quarters and thinking, with a clarity that apparently stayed with him for decades, "This is not me." But he put on the coat, he went upstairs, he stood at his post, and eventually, through the long practice of the role, he became someone who could wear it, not someone who forgot the distance between the role and himself, but someone who could perform it without that performance consuming him. The housekeeper's keys, authority, knowledge, and the weight of responsibility. I want to return now to the housekeeper, because the housekeeper is in many ways the most interesting figure in the Victorian domestic household, and we have not yet done full justice to her. We have talked about her skills, her still room, her accounts. But there is a dimension of her position that we have not yet addressed, and it is the dimension that is most illuminating of the nature of authority and knowledge in the Victorian domestic world. That dimension is her keys. The housekeeper's keys were not merely a practical implement. They were, in a very direct sense, the symbol and the substance of her authority. She carried them on her person, on a ring or a chain at her waist, in the traditional image that has become almost a caricature, but that was rooted in a real practice. The keys gave her access to the locked stores of the household, the wine cellar, though this was typically the butler's province, the still room, the linen closet, the store cupboards where the valuable dry goods were kept, the sugar loaf, the tea, the spices, the dried fruits that in the earlier Victorian period were still expensive enough to be stored under lock and key. The keys gave her access to the silver room, to the china cupboard, to the various locked spaces that contained the household's valuable portable property. The weight of those keys was the weight of responsibility. Every item in those locked stores was her responsibility. If the sugar was found to be short, if the tea supply ran down faster than the household's consumption should have allowed, she was the one who would answer for it. The household accounts were her record of what had come in and what had gone out, and they had to balance, not with the exact precision of a bank statement, but with the general accuracy that competent management required. This responsibility was serious, and the management of stores in a Victorian household was, in fact, a non-trivial operation. Consider tea. Tea was, by the middle of the Victorian period, a staple of the English household at all social levels. But it was still expensive enough that its management in the household was a matter of deliberate attention. The best quality teas, the fine Chinese teas that were served in the drawing room, were considerably more expensive than the lower grades. The management of the tea stocks involved keeping track of how much of each type was on hand, ordering more when necessary, and ensuring that the right tea was used for the right occasion. This last point was more significant than it might appear. In the Victorian household, the same tea was not necessarily served to all members of the household. The family received the best tea. The upper servants, the housekeeper, the butler, the cook, the lady's maid, might receive a tea of somewhat lower quality but still respectable character. The lower servants received a still lower grade. This gradation of tea quality by household rank was not unusual or considered particularly harsh. It was simply part of the hierarchy that organized every aspect of the household's operation, but it required management. The housekeeper had to know which tin was which, had to ensure that the kitchen maid who came to the store for tea for the servants' hall did not inadvertently or deliberately take from the supply intended for the drawing room. The keys enforced this hierarchy. The housekeeper's authority was real and extensive. Within the household, below the level of the employing family itself, she was the most powerful person in the domestic hierarchy, either equivalent to or slightly above the butler, depending on the particular arrangements of the individual household. She hired and dismissed the female servants. She set their work schedules. She supervised their performance. She dealt with their complaints and disputes. She was responsible for their moral welfare, a phrase that, in the Victorian context, encompassed everything from ensuring that they attended church on their designated Sunday to monitoring their relationships with men. This last responsibility was a source of considerable delicacy, because the female servants of the Victorian household were, almost without exception, unmarried women. Marriage for a domestic servant almost always meant the end of service. A married woman was not employed as a domestic servant in the standard arrangements of the period, because it was assumed that her primary obligations were to her own household rather than her employer's. So the households were staffed by single women, some of them very young girls as young as 13 or 14 in some cases, though this became less common as the century progressed, and the housekeeper was responsible for their welfare in an almost parental sense. Followers were strictly forbidden in most households. A follower was the term for a male admirer, a young man who might come to the back door to see one of the maids, or who might be waiting for a servant in her brief off-duty time. The rule against followers was both a practical and a moral regulation, and its enforcement was one of the more delicate of the housekeeper's responsibilities, because the enforcement of this rule required judgment, a rigid, inflexible interpretation, no contact with any male person outside the household under any circumstances, was both impractical and, in the opinion of many thoughtful housekeepers, unjust. Young women who were working away from their families needed normal social contact. They needed to be able to receive letters, to see their own relatives on their days off, to conduct the ordinary social business of young womanhood. What needed to be prevented was the specific set of arrangements that could lead to trouble: the servant girl who was conducting a secret romance with someone unsuitable, who was meeting a man without the knowledge of her employer, who was creating the conditions for either seduction or an unsuitable marriage that would damage her prospects. The housekeeper navigated this. She watched. She knew, usually, a great deal more about the private social lives of her staff than they imagined she did. She intervened when intervention was necessary and turned a blind eye when blind eyes were appropriate. She was, in this dimension as in others, exercising a kind of authority that was not fully visible, that operated below the level of formal policy through informal knowledge and informal action. Authority that came from being present, being attentive, being experienced, and being trusted. The housekeeper was, in most cases, a woman who had risen through the ranks of domestic service, who had been a housemaid or a still-room maid or a lady's maid, and who had accumulated over years the experience and the skills and the judgment that made her suitable for the management role. She was not young. The youngest housekeepers in the larger establishments were typically in their late 30s or early 40s. Most were in their 40s or 50s. They had spent the majority of their adult lives in service, in various positions, gradually moving upward through the hierarchy. What had they given up for this? Marriage, for most of them. The housekeeper was almost always unmarried, sometimes a widow, who retained the courtesy title of Mrs. that was conventionally given to housekeepers regardless of their marital status, but more often a single woman who had simply not married. This was partly circumstantial. The conditions of service made sustained courtship difficult, and the years when a woman was most likely to marry were often the years she was most fully occupied with the demands of a junior service position. But it was also, for some of them, a deliberate choice, or at least a choice that was made gradually through years of small decisions and small accommodations, rather than a single dramatic moment of renunciation. The housekeeper who had spent 30 years becoming the best at what she did was, in a real sense, a professional. A professional in a world that did not use that word about domestic service. A professional in a world that considered domestic service to be the least prestigious form of women's work, lower in status than a shopkeeper's position or a dressmaker's. And yet the housekeeper who ran a large house, who managed its staff, its stores, its accounts, its daily and seasonal operations, was exercising a level of organizational and managerial skill that, in a different context, in a different body, would have been recognized and rewarded quite differently. This is not a novel observation. It was made, with increasing directness, by the later Victorian reformers who were beginning to reconsider the social position of domestic service, and who noticed the discrepancy between the genuine skill and responsibility of the work and the social status it conferred. But the recognition came slowly and incompletely. And for most of the Victorian period, the housekeeper with her keys and her household book remained what she always had been, the invisible engine of the household's functioning, noticed primarily in the unlikely event that something went wrong. The nursery, a household within the household, somewhere in the large Victorian house, above the main floor and below the servants' attics, there was a set of rooms that operated in many ways like a household within the household, the nursery. The Victorian nursery was a world of its own. It had its own routines, its own hierarchies, its own particular rules and standards, its own smell, a distinctive mixture of soap and talcum and bread and milk, and the particular warm, slightly close atmosphere of small children and the people who care for them. The nursery staff were a separate, small hierarchy. At the top was the nurse, sometimes called the nurse, sometimes the nanny. The terminology was not entirely standardized, who was responsible for the care and welfare of the children. Below her was the nursery maid, or in smaller households, a single nursery maid who assisted with the practical care. In large families or wealthy households, there might be several layers of nursery staff. The nurse or nanny occupied a peculiar and important position in the Victorian household. She had charge of the children, sometimes from infancy, sometimes from toddlerhood onward, for the majority of their waking hours. In the arrangements typical of the upper and upper middle classes, the children spent the morning and part of the afternoon in the nursery, coming down to spend a short, formal hour or so with their parents in the late afternoon before being taken up for supper and bed. The nurse was with them for all the time that the parents were not, which was, in these arrangements, the majority of every day. The intimacy of this was, again, complex. The Victorian child of the privileged classes was in some ways closer, in daily terms, to the nurse who cared for them than to the parents whom they visited formally. The nurse's voice was the constant voice of childhood. Her hands were the hands that washed and dressed and fed. Her face was the last face seen before sleep. And yet the nurse, however loved, was the servant. This is one of the places where the Victorian domestic arrangements create the most interesting and complex emotional situations. Because the child formed attachments to the nurse, and the nurse, being human, formed attachments to the child. These attachments were real. They lasted. There are memoirs from the late Victorian and early Edwardian period in which grown men and women describe their old nurses with an affection and a grief that is entirely genuine. And there are accounts, harder to find, but occasionally preserved, of what the nurses themselves felt about the children in their care. The particular love that develops for a child you have watched grow from infancy, whose first steps you witnessed, whose first words you heard, whose nighttime fears you soothed. A love that was genuine and that had, when the employment ended, as it always did, either when the children grew beyond nursery age, or when the nurse retired, or when various other circumstances of life intervened, a quality of loss that the social framework of the time did not quite provide language for. The specific domestic tasks of the nursery were their own category. The laundering of children's clothing was separate from the general household laundry. Children's clothes needed more frequent washing, and the fabrics were different, and the particular challenges of children's staining, which are numerous and creative, required their own approaches. The preparation of children's food was separate from the family's cooking. The nursery meals were simple, nourishing, regular, quite different from the elaborate multi-course affairs of the adult dining room. The nursery breakfast was porridge, or bread and milk, or a simple egg. The nursery dinner was a plain roast or a stew or a simple baked dish. The nursery tea was bread and butter, perhaps with a small cake. These meals were prepared in the nursery or brought up from the kitchen in their simple form, rather than arriving in the elaborate service that characterized the adult meals. The nursery fire was kept burning more carefully and more continuously than other fires because of the presence of small children. The fireguard, the metal screen that stood before the fire to prevent sparks and to prevent small children from approaching too closely, was one of the household fittings specifically associated with the nursery, and its maintenance was taken seriously. The toys. The nursery contained, in a well-provisioned household, a significant quantity of toys: the rocking horse, the doll's house, the various games and puzzles and building materials of the period, and their maintenance and organization was the nursery maid's responsibility. Broken toys were repaired if possible. Toy boxes were kept organized. Small pieces of games were kept track of, with the vigilance that anyone who has looked after small children will recognize as absolutely necessary and absolutely unreliable. The nursery maid's relationship to the children was different from the nurse's. She was younger, typically, sometimes barely more than a girl herself, a young woman in her first service position, learning her work in the practical school of small children. She was the one who did the rougher physical work, the heavier laundry, the cleaning of the nursery itself, the carrying of the nursery's coal supply. The nurse supervised and was the primary carer, The nursery maid did the supporting work, and the children treated them accordingly. The nurse was an authority figure, loved, respected, sometimes feared in the productive way that a consistent and caring authority figure is appropriately feared by small children. The nursery maid was often something slightly more like an older sister, familiar, approachable, less authoritative. The children knew intuitively the difference. This was, again, the hierarchy working itself into every relationship, even the relationships between adults and small children in a room full of toys. And as the night deepens around us, let us allow the nursery to settle into quiet. Let the small fires burn low. Let the children sleep. The house is doing what houses do in the deep of the night. It breathes. Not literally, of course, but there is something in the way a large, inhabited house sounds and feels in the very late hours that suggests a breathing quality. The settling of timbers as temperatures change, the small sounds of pipes cooling or heating, the very faint sound of the wind finding the small gaps around the windows and the doors. The house breathes. And the servants sleep in their various rooms and quarters in the brief window between the end of the evening's work and the beginning of the next morning's. A few hours only, but enough. Country versus city, the two worlds of Victorian service, the narrative has softened considerably. We are in the third hour now. The pacing is deliberately slow and rhythmic. Everything we have discussed so far has been, more or less, the composite image of the Victorian household. A generalized account, drawing on the experiences and the records of many different houses and many different servants across the span of the Victorian era. But the Victorian household was not one thing. It existed in many forms, in many places, at many levels of wealth and staffing. And perhaps the most important distinction, the distinction that shaped the experience of service most fundamentally, was the distinction between the country house and the city house. The large rural establishment on the one hand, and the London or provincial townhouse on the other. Let us begin in the country. The country house, I am thinking now of a house of medium to large size in the English countryside, perhaps in Hampshire or Yorkshire or Shropshire, standing in its own grounds with a home farm, a kitchen garden, a stable yard, and a considerable park, was a self-contained world in a way that the city house was not. The country house grew some of its own food. The kitchen garden laid out in formal beds behind its high brick walls, managed by the head gardener and his staff of under-gardeners and gardening boys, produced vegetables, fruit, cut flowers for the house, and soft fruit for the preserving operations of the still room. In the right season and in a well-organized garden, it produced a remarkable variety and quantity of things. Asparagus, from the established beds that took years to develop. Peaches and nectarines, growing against the south-facing brick walls that held the sun's heat. Grapes in the vinery, pineapples in the pine house, heated by fermenting dung beneath the beds, requiring constant management. The kitchen garden's relationship with the household was one of close daily communication. Each morning, the cook sent a list of requirements to the gardener, or the head gardener came to the kitchen to discuss what was at its best and available. Produce was brought in daily, or several times a day in busy periods. The transition from garden to kitchen was direct and immediate in a way that has almost entirely disappeared from our contemporary experience of food. The home farm produced dairy products, eggs, sometimes meat. The dairy, a separate building, cool and clean, often with stone shelves and a spring or piped cold water to maintain the necessary low temperatures, produced the household's butter, cream, and cheese. The dairy maid was a specialized figure, with her own skills and her own domain. All of this gave the country house an economic self-sufficiency and a connection to its physical environment that the city house did not have. The country house, at least in theory, and to a considerable extent in practice, fed itself, and the servants of the country house were part of that system. They were not, strictly speaking, agricultural workers. The domestic servants were separate from the outdoor staff, the gardeners and grooms and estate workers who worked in a different hierarchy under the agent or the steward. But the boundaries were not always perfectly clear, and in smaller households particularly, the distinction between the indoor and outdoor worlds was more fluid. A young man might begin as a garden boy and work his way into the house. A servant with agricultural knowledge might be called upon in busy periods. The city house was different. In the city, in London particularly, which was the dominant urban environment of the Victorian world, the household operated in a completely different set of material conditions. The city house was smaller. Even a prosperous Victorian London townhouse in the fashionable streets of Belgravia or Mayfair or Kensington was physically much smaller than the equivalent status country house. It was narrower. The typical London townhouse was a vertical building on a constrained footprint, rising 5 or 6 floors from basement to attic. The rooms were smaller. The staff was smaller. The city house could not grow its own food. It purchased everything. This meant a daily relationship with tradespeople, the butcher, the fishmonger, the baker, the greengrocer, the poulterer, the wine merchant. That was one of the primary management tasks of the cook and the housekeeper. The purchasing of food for the city household was not simply a matter of ordering whatever was needed. It was a skilled operation with its own economics and its own professional relationships. The cook had standing arrangements with particular tradespeople whose quality and reliability she trusted. She knew the market, what was in season, what was freshly arrived at market, what the current prices were for various items, what the signs of quality were for different foodstuffs. A cook who was a poor buyer could significantly increase the household's food costs, and her employer knew this. The relationship with the tradespeople was also a relationship in which the informal economics we discussed earlier, the small commissions, the kickbacks from merchants to buyers, were most likely to operate. A cook who directed a household's custom to a particular butcher or fishmonger might, over time, be rewarded by that tradespeople with small gifts or a portion of the profit. This was known. It was condemned in household manuals. It continued anyway. The city house also had a different relationship to air, to light, and to the particular chemical cocktail of the Victorian urban atmosphere. London air in the Victorian period was genuinely terrible. The combination of coal smoke from millions of domestic fires and industrial furnaces, fog from the river, the emissions of the gasworks and the leather tanners and the other urban industries, and the organic waste of a city of millions of people, horses, cattle, human beings, produced an atmospheric quality that had to be experienced to be fully appreciated. The great fogs, the particulars as they were called, the dense yellowish-brown smogs that sometimes settled over the city for days at a time, were not merely unpleasant, they were dangerous. They killed people, particularly those with respiratory conditions. For the servants of the London house, this atmospheric quality had direct practical consequences. Surfaces were dirtier in the city. The windows needed cleaning more frequently. The curtains collected soot more rapidly. The paintwork in the rooms faced south and west, facing the prevailing wind and the street, darkened more quickly. The cleaning regime in the London house was, in certain respects, more intensive than in the country, simply because the environmental challenge was greater. The city servants also had less outdoor space. No kitchen garden, no stable yard to retreat to in spare moments, no park to walk in. They were confined, more fully than their country counterparts, to the house and its immediate environment. The city street, in the fashionable districts at least, was not a place for domestic servants to linger or walk for pleasure, at least not in the hours when they might be visible. This physical confinement was a real feature of city service, and it was noted by people who had experience of both. The country house was constricting in its social hierarchies and its demands on time and energy, but it was physically open in a way the city house was not. There was air and ground and distance. Small houses, large burdens, the maid of all work I have spoken, throughout this evening, largely of the staffed household, the household with multiple servants, with a hierarchy, with specialized roles. And I have done this because the specialized household is, in many ways, the most interesting to examine in detail, with its intricate hierarchies and its elaborate rituals. But I want to dwell now, for a chapter, on a figure who does not belong to the multi-servant household at all. A figure who is, in statistical terms, far more common than any butler or lady's maid or footman, and whose working life was in some ways the most demanding of any domestic servant. This is the maid of all work. The maid of all work, the general servant, the sole servant, the girl who did everything, was employed in the houses that could afford only one servant. These were the houses of the lower middle classes, the families of clerks, small shopkeepers, minor professionals, teachers, the lower ranks of the civil service. Families who could not quite afford to not have any servant at all. The social expectations of the time made the complete absence of any domestic help a significant social marker, but who could afford only one. This one servant did everything. She got up first. She did the fires. She cleaned the boots. She prepared and served the breakfast. She cleaned the kitchen and scullery. She did the marketing if the housewife was not disposed to do it herself. She did the cooking. She cleaned the rooms. She did the laundry. She waited at the simple family dinner table in whatever capacity waiting was performed in a household this modest. She cleared up the dinner. She put the children to bed if there were children. She washed the supper things. She laid the morning's fire. She went to bed, and then she got up first. She did all of the work that, in the large household, was distributed among a staff of 10 or 15 or 20, with each person doing a specialized portion. She did it alone. The scale of this is difficult to hold onto fully, because domestic work in the Victorian era was not just demanding in the way we have described, the fires, the laundry, the cooking, the cleaning. It was demanding in cumulative quantity. In the large household, the cumulative quantity was distributed. In the household with one servant, it was not distributed. It fell on one person. She was typically young. The maid of all work was, in the statistics of Victorian domestic service, disproportionately likely to be in her teens or early 20s. This is not coincidental. The physically demanding character of the work and the very low wages it paid made it a position that older and more experienced women generally sought to leave rather than enter, and that the youngest and least experienced women were most likely to find themselves in. The wages were very low. In the Middle Victorian period, a maid of all work might receive £5 or £6 a year with her board. An experienced cook in a good house might receive 5 times as much. The maid of all work was at the very bottom of the wage scale because she was at the bottom of the experience scale, because she had the least leverage in the employment market, because the households who employed her had the least resources. The household manuals of the Victorian period devoted considerable attention to the maid of all work, and the tone of these sections is, I find, rather interesting. On one hand, the manuals are practical and detailed, providing guidance on how to manage the competing demands of the various tasks, how to organize the day so that the most important things were done first, how to cook and clean simultaneously, how to manage the fire so that it served multiple purposes. This is genuinely useful guidance, and it is offered, for the most part, in a tone of professional respect for the challenge of the work. On the other hand, there is a curious tendency in these manuals to make the maid of all work's predicament seem more manageable than it actually was. The advice is frequently based on assumptions of brisk efficiency and perfect organization that, in the reality of a cold kitchen and an unlit fire and a household full of demanding occupants, were not always achievable. The historian and writer Hannah Cullwick, whose extraordinary diaries, kept through the 1860s, provide one of the most detailed first-person accounts of Victorian working-class domestic labor that survives, described her working days with a plainness and a specificity that the household manuals conspicuously lack. Cullwick worked as a general servant in various positions through her young adulthood, and her diaries record the actual texture of the work, the burned hands from the range, the persistent ache in the back from the heavy carrying, the days when the cold was so severe that the water froze in the kitchen before she could use it. She wrote with no self-pity. She was actually rather proud of her work and of her physical strength and endurance. But she wrote with complete honesty, and her honesty cuts through the comfortable euphemisms of the household manuals to something more real. There were millions of women in Hannah Cullwick's position in Victorian Britain, millions of women who got up in the dark and did everything and went to bed exhausted and got up in the dark again. Their names are mostly lost. Their experiences are preserved in fragmentary form in the occasional diary, the occasional letter, the occasional oral history recorded late in life by someone who remembered. But the fires they lit, and the boots they cleaned, and the steps they scrubbed, those left their own record in the smooth stone of steps that have been worn down over decades of scrubbing, in the grooves worn in stone floors by the passage of the same feet over the same route, year after year. The house remembers. Illness in the house. What happened when sickness came? Let us talk about what happened when someone in the house fell ill. Not a minor illness, not the common cold or the passing discomfort that was treated with a day in bed and a dose of laudanum, which was the all-purpose Victorian remedy for an uncomfortable range of conditions. I mean a more serious illness. A fever, perhaps, or a condition that required extended care, or a crisis of the kind that happened without warning in an era when medical understanding was still in many areas quite limited, because illness in the Victorian household was not simply a matter of summoning a doctor and following instructions. The care of the sick in the home was a substantial part of the domestic operation. The doctor was called, yes, but the doctor came once a day, perhaps. Between visits, the patient was in the care of the household, and the practical care of a sick person, the maintaining of their room at a specific temperature, the preparation of their special foods, the management of their medications, the changing of their bedding, the sitting with them through the night, all of this fell to the domestic staff. The housekeeper typically took primary responsibility for managing a serious illness in the house. She coordinated the care, she communicated with the doctor, she ensured that the various elements of the care regime were maintained consistently. The lady's maid took particular care of the mistress if it was the mistress who was ill. In the case of a child's illness, the nurse assumed the primary carer role. The kitchen was pressed into service in a specific way during illness. The Victorian approach to sick nursing, which was only beginning to be professionalized in the latter part of the era, under the influence of Florence Nightingale's work, placed considerable emphasis on food and nourishment. Beef tea, made from the slow simmering of lean beef in water, producing a thin but intensely flavored broth that was held to be particularly restorative, was one of the principal invalid foods. It required careful preparation. The beef had to be of the right type, the proportion of water correct, the cooking time long enough to extract the nourishment without producing a cloudy or greasy result. Arrowroot preparations, arrowroot cooked in water or milk with a small amount of flavoring, producing a thin, bland, easily digestible porridge-like substance, were another standard invalid food. The careful preparation of these invalid foods was not trivial. A poor beef tea, greasy, cloudy, poorly flavored, was not just unappetizing. In the medical understanding of the time, it was genuinely believed to be less nutritious and therefore less therapeutically effective than a properly made one. The cook who prepared invalid food for a seriously ill household member was performing what she understood to be a genuinely medical function. There was another dimension of illness in the Victorian house that is perhaps less immediately obvious, and that is the question of contagion. The Victorian period was one of the most eventful eras in the history of the understanding of infectious disease. The germ theory of disease, the idea that specific diseases were caused by specific microorganisms, was being developed and established through the middle and latter decades of the century, largely through the work of Pasteur, Koch, and Lister. The practical public health implications were beginning to be understood and acted upon, but this process of understanding was not complete within the Victorian period, and the practical arrangements of households were shaped by a mixture of new understanding and older theories that were slowly being displaced. The fear of contagion in the Victorian household was real and was acted upon. When a member of the household developed an illness that was understood to be contagious, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, diphtheria, tuberculosis, the response was a set of isolation and disinfection practices that reflected a genuine attempt to prevent spread, even if the mechanisms of that spread were not fully understood. Isolation of the sick person was the first measure. Separate rooms, separate utensils, separate everything. The sick person's room became a quarantine zone. Then there was disinfection. The substances used for this purpose in the Victorian household included carbolic acid, Lister's great antiseptic discovery, which entered domestic use quite quickly after its introduction in the late 1860s, as well as chloride of lime, sulfur, various other compounds. The disinfection of a sick room after an infectious illness involved burning sulfur or spraying carbolic solutions on the walls and surfaces, washing down the room with diluted disinfectant, and airing it thoroughly. The bedding of the sick room was, after a serious illness, typically boiled. Items that could not be boiled might be aired for extended periods in strong sunlight, which was understood, again empirically, to have some sanitizing effect. All of this disinfection and cleaning was done by the servants. This is not a trivial detail. The servants who cleaned the sick room after a case of typhoid or scarlet fever were exposing themselves to the infectious agents, handling contaminated materials, working in close proximity to everything that had touched the illness. The irony, if irony is the right word, is that the people most likely to be exposed to the infection were the people who had least access to the medical care and convalescent conditions that might help them recover from it. This is one of those places where the arrangements of the Victorian household, seen clearly and honestly, were genuinely unjust, and where acknowledging that fact is more faithful to the history than polishing it over. The servants who cared for the sick, and who then became sick themselves, and some did, were not generally afforded the same quality of care as the household members they had been serving. They were sent home to their families if they had families. They were given a week off if they did not. They recovered or they did not. The house went on. The turn of the century, and what was already changing let us move, now with the same careful pace, toward the end of the Victorian era. Not the end of the era we have been exploring, that will come in its own time, but the approach to the historical end. To the 1890s, when the 19th century began to feel the approach of its own conclusion, and when the world that domestic service had served for so long began, very slowly, to change. The domestic service world of the 1890s was not identical to the domestic service world of the 1840s. Time had passed, technologies had changed, social attitudes had shifted, and the people who went into service, or who chose not to go into service, were beginning to have choices they had not had before. Let us begin with technology. The latter Victorian period brought to the domestic house a series of mechanical and technical improvements that began, cautiously and unevenly, to reduce the labor required for certain tasks. The carpet sweeper, Bissell's invention, which we mentioned much earlier, became a genuine tool in the Victorian housemaid's kit. The mechanical mangle, replacing hand wringing in the laundry. The gas cooker, in the houses that were already connected to the gas supply, offering a supplement to or replacement for the coal range that was easier to manage and easier to control. There was, as the century ended, the early electric lighting. Electric light arrived in the great country houses and the fashionable London houses in the 1880s and 1890s. Queen Victoria had electricity installed at Balmoral and Windsor in the early 1880s. The first domestic installations were by no means universal or fully reliable, and the transition from gas to electric was gradual and uneven. But where it arrived, it changed things. The morning lamp trimming was gone, or at least reduced. The accumulation of soot around the gas jets disappeared. The particular quality of light in the rooms changed, became steadier, cooler, brighter, in a way that some found deeply uncomfortable. A change from the warm intimacy of gas and candlelight to something that felt, at least initially, rather clinical. And one of the most labor-intensive morning tasks, the daily cleaning and trimming of the oil lamps in the households that still had them, was simply abolished in the houses that made the transition. This was, from the servant's perspective, a genuine improvement, but it was an improvement that arrived without any formal acknowledgement of the labor it replaced. The lamp was simply gone. The task was simply gone. No one recorded in the household accounts a reduction in work attributable to electrification. The house simply required rather less of the people who served it in this one specific area, and life went on. More significant than the technological changes in the long run were the social ones. The 1870 Education Act in England and Wales introduced compulsory elementary education for the first time. This meant that by the 1880s and 1890s, young women entering domestic service for the first time had almost universally been to school. They could read, they could write, they could do basic arithmetic. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. A servant who could read and write had a different relationship to the world of information than one who could not. She could read the household manual herself, rather than receiving all instruction orally. She could write letters to her family, to friends, to the domestic employment registry. She could read the advertisements for positions in the registry office's windows. She could, in short, navigate the employment market with a degree of independence and agency that was less available to the illiterate woman. And she could read the newspapers. And the newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s were beginning to discuss things that were directly relevant to her situation. There were articles about the conditions of domestic service, about the long hours, the restricted freedom, the exposure to difficult employers, the minimal legal protections. There were organizations, still small, still limited in their reach, but genuinely present, that were beginning to advocate for the interests of domestic servants. There were discussions in parlors and newspapers and early social reform literature about the question of whether domestic service as it was currently organized was a just arrangement. The servants themselves were not, in general, radical. The culture of domestic service, its emphasis on loyalty, on the maintenance of the household standards, on the identity of the good servant as a professional who took pride in their work, was not naturally disposed toward collective political action. And the conditions of the work itself, the dispersal of servants across many individual households, the surveillance and the vertical loyalty structure, the dependence on individual employer references for advancement, made organized collective action quite difficult in practical terms. But the thinking was happening. The world was changing. More women were finding employment in the new department stores as shop assistants, in the new typewriting pools as clerks, in the expanding teaching profession, in the new telephone exchanges. These were jobs that did not require living in someone else's house, that did not require 24-hour availability, that did not require studied indifference and invisible labor. They paid modestly, often less than domestic service with its board and lodging, but they allowed a different kind of life. The supply of women willing to go into domestic service, which had been essentially unlimited through most of the Victorian period, began, very gradually, toward the century's end, to tighten. Employers began to complain about the difficulty of finding good servants. This complaint, which would become a dominant theme in the Edwardian period and would develop into a genuine social crisis during and after the First World War, was present in embryonic form in the 1890s. The world that had made the Victorian domestic house possible was beginning, very slowly, to shift beneath itself. The woman who had been a housemaid in 1855 and who, by 1895, was in her 60s and had retired to a small cottage near her old employer's country house, or who was spending her final years in an almshouse or in the household of a married niece, might have found the changes around her puzzling or interesting or simply too distant from her own experience to feel very strongly about. She had served in houses her entire life. She had cleaned the fires and carried the water and maintained the studied indifference and polished the silver. She had done all of it, year after year, for wages that the world agreed were appropriate for someone of her position. She had not thought of herself, for the most part, as a victim of injustice. She had thought of herself as a professional, as someone who knew how to do certain things very well. As someone whose work maintained the standards of the household, and whose standards were, in the modest and particular way of a person who had never asked anyone to notice them, something to be quietly proud of. She had known the house, in the dark, in the early morning, in the back passages and the servants' staircase and the stone kitchen and the cool of the cellar. And the house, in whatever way a house can be said to carry the impression of those who have lived and worked in it, in the worn stone of the step, in the particular creak of the attic stair, in the smooth groove worn in the wooden handle of the copper's door, the house had known her. This, at the end, is what I want to leave you with, not a dramatic conclusion, not a sweeping statement about history or society or the nature of labor. Just the simple and, to me, rather moving fact of the relationship between a person and a place. The way that years of daily presence, of hands on surfaces, of feet on floors, of eyes moving through the same rooms in the same light at the same hours, year after year, create something between a person and a place that is not quite possession and not quite love, but that is real and that is lasting. The servants are gone from those houses now. Most of the houses are gone too, or converted or changed beyond recognition. But somewhere in the thickness of an old wall, in the worn groove of a stone step, in the particular way a very old door falls shut quietly, carefully, as if someone learned long ago to close it without making a sound, somewhere in all of that, the work continues. The things that were never said, there is a set of things that exist in our story, entirely in the negative. In the space of what was not said, not recorded, not acknowledged, I want to spend a little time in that space, because the Victorian household, for all its elaborate systems of protocol and hierarchy and management, had a very particular way of not talking about certain things, not in a conspiratorial or deceptive way necessarily, more in the way that any complex social system develops habitual silences around its own contradictions. The servants were not thanked. Not as a rule, not in a systematic way. In some households, some employers were considerate and expressed appreciation in the specific way that Victorian social norms permitted such expression. But the formal structure of the household did not include gratitude as a regular feature. The servant performed the work, the employer received it. The exchange was commercial and social, and not primarily emotional. The servant's physical discomfort was not acknowledged. Not the cold of the early morning kitchen, not the ache of the back from the carrying, not the rawness of the hands from the laundry work. These things existed. Everyone knew they existed, in the way that one knows things one has decided not to attend to. The household manual occasionally acknowledged, in passing, that the work was hard, but the hardness was treated as an intrinsic condition rather than something that should be examined or addressed. The servants' inner lives were not acknowledged. The servant who was homesick, who was unhappy, who was afraid, who was grieving a loss, that person existed behind the face of studied indifference and went unmet in the specific emotional sense by the social arrangements of the household. Individual employers varied enormously in how much human recognition they extended to their servants. Some were genuinely kind, in a way that the formal structure would have permitted them not to be. Others were not unkind exactly, but simply absent from the servant as a person, though entirely present to the service. And the servants did not, for the most part, say these things, not to the employer, not typically in letters which might be read, not even perhaps in their own thoughts, which over years could be shaped by the norms of the world you live in, to the point where certain things become simply not quite articulable. What was said in some of these accounts was quieter and more specific. Not "I was miserable" or "the conditions were unjust," but "the kitchen was very cold in January," or "the housekeeper was a difficult woman," or "the family went away for the summer and we had 6 weeks of reduced work and I was very glad of it." The specific and practical as a vehicle for the general and emotional. This is very human when you think about it. It is how a great deal of human experience is communicated, in every era and every class and every culture. Not as the large abstract statement, but as the small concrete detail that carries, for anyone paying attention, the full weight of the lived experience. The kitchen was very cold in January, and as the night deepens and the fire settles lower and the January cold presses against the windows of the house, let us stay here for a little while, in this quiet. In this specific and ordinary and extraordinary dark, the kitchen range will need to be lit in a few hours. The ash bucket is ready. The black lead mixture is in its small tin on the shelf. The kindling is in the basket beside the range. Everything is ready as it is every night for the morning's beginning. The bells are silent on their board. The silver gleams faintly in its locked room. The linen is folded very precisely in the closet where the smell of lavender has lived for years. The house breathes. Outside, the elm trees creak very softly in the dark. The gravel drive is pale in the starlight. The tall sash windows of the upper house reflect the night sky. The house looks from outside as though it has always been exactly as it is, permanent, self-sufficient, existing in its own still light. But we know otherwise. We know the green baize door. We know the back staircase. We know the stone passage and the coal cellar and the copper in the laundry and the silver room and the housekeeper's keys and the attic where, by the light of a candle stub, someone is writing a letter home. We know the work. We know the hands that did it. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. Perhaps knowing is enough.